This story is about Yamagishi Haruka's life, an old man who had always been quietly miserable. At work, he endured constant scolding from his superiors and complete disregard from his juniors. No one respected him, and no one cared. He had no partner, no passion, and no purpose, only a dull routine that repeated itself until the day he died. One day, when he opened his eyes, the world around him had changed. He awoke in the middle of a vast forest, sunlight filtering through the leaves above. The air smelled clean and vivid, unlike anything he had known before. When he looked down at his own hands, he froze. His skin was smooth and dark, his body slender and unfamiliar. And when he caught sight of his reflection in the nearby river, he nearly stopped breathing. A woman stared back at him, an impossibly beautiful dark elf with silver hair and red eyes, her figure graceful and otherworldly. For a long moment, he could only stare. The legends of fantasy novels he once read had taken shape before him, and somehow he had become one of them. Yet inside, he remained the same middle-aged man he had always been, uncertain whether to laugh or despair at this absurd transformation. A sudden cry echoed from deep within the forest, distant yet sharp. It was not human. The sound reminded him of where he was, a world far removed from the ordinary. If this were a manga, he thought, someone would have summoned him as a hero, or perhaps he would have received a divine message. But there was nothing, only silence and a sense of isolation. The realization struck hard. He was utterly alone in an unknown world. Anxiety crept in as he imagined surviving without food, shelter, or anyone to speak to. Trying to calm his nerves, Haruka picked up a fallen branch and held it like a wand. In his childhood, he had dreamed of being a magician or hero of justice. Perhaps, in this world, such dreams might not be impossible. He focused his thoughts on fire, a large, roaring blaze like the bonfires he had seen on television. He visualized it vividly, imagined its heat and its motion, then spoke a single word: burn, with confidence. A violent flash of flame erupted before him, the air trembling with heat. The fire leapt toward the river, hissing and devouring everything in its path. Haruka stood frozen, overwhelmed by shock and awe. It was real. He had used magic, but his elation quickly turned to fear. The flames were far stronger than he intended, difficult to control. As he turned around, he found a man standing a few meters away, an armored soldier, sword drawn, his expression tense. For a moment, neither moved. The soldier's eyes were wide with caution. Haruka's heart pounded in his chest. He had never faced a real weapon before, and could only raise his hands slowly, hoping to show he meant no harm. Yet as he did, the soldier's body trembled uncontrollably. The man pissed on his pants, and to Haruka's disbelief, his knees gave out and collapsed to the ground in panic. Embarrassed by the scene, Haruka suggested, hesitantly, that the man compose himself before they continued. When the armored stranger returned, he carried himself as though nothing had happened. He introduced himself as Ralph, a second-class adventurer from a city called Orans. The words felt surreal. Adventurers, cities, ranks. It was a world born of fiction made real before his eyes. When Haruka tried to introduce himself, he faltered. He was a dark elf on the outside, but inside still an aging man with a forgotten past. Unsure of what else to say, he gave his real name and claimed to have lost his memories. Ralph accepted the explanation without hesitation, though surprise flickered across his face. By the way, since Haruka turned into a female elf, from now on we'll refer to Haruka as she, okay? Anyway, Haruka asked if Ralph could guide him to the nearest settlement. The adventurer agreed readily, and together they set out through the forest. Along the way, Ralph explained fragments of the world's structure and customs. Before long, the trees thinned and revealed a bustling city surrounded by stone walls and towers. It was called Orans, part of the merchant city-state of Plain, a nation built on freedom and merit. The streets were alive with voices, merchants, and travelers. Ralph first took Haruka to a tailor's shop to buy her a pair of shoes and a notebook, insisting she needed proper equipment. As they walked, he explained the adventurer system, a ranking that began at the 10th class and ascended to the 1st, with the highest tier known as special rank, individuals said to rival monsters in strength. Haruka listened intently, recording every detail in neat handwriting. Ralph then suggested that she, too, register as an adventurer. With her ability to use magic and the rare heritage of a dark elf, she would stand out naturally. Smiling, Ralph promised to take her to the guild the next morning and left her at a nearby inn to rest. Inside her small rented room, Haruka reviewed her notes. Terms like mana, spells, and incantations filled the pages, concepts that felt both foreign and fascinating. For the first time in years, she was learning with genuine curiosity. As she lay on the bed, memories of her former life crept back. Long hours at the office, endless reprimands, late nights that ended only in exhaustion. Her life had been an unbroken pattern of work, eat, and sleep, a hollow existence without purpose or joy. Slowly, even the desire to hope had faded away. Now, in this strange new world, that emptiness felt distant. For once, the future did not seem predetermined or dull. Closing her eyes, Haruka allowed herself a quiet thought. Perhaps this was not a curse, but a chance. The room fell silent, the air calm and still, as she drifted into sleep beneath an unfamiliar sky. The next morning, Haruka woke up and went down to the inn's dining area, only to feel dozens of eyes turned toward her. People stared in shock, whispering to one another. She froze, confused. Were dark elves really that rare here? A girl with bangs was staring straight at her, her gaze lingering far too long. Uneasy, Haruka quickly turned around and decided to take her breakfast to her room instead. She had just begun eating when someone knocked on the door. Ralph stood there, smiling as usual. But the moment he saw Haruka, his face stiffened. Without a word, he snatched the empty plate from her hands, cleared his throat, and said she should probably wear something less revealing. That's when it hit her. The stares from earlier maybe weren't because she was a dark elf. It was because her clothes were too exposed. Flustered, Haruka hurriedly slipped her jacket back on. Ralph then invited her to go outside. As they walked through the streets, Haruka noticed the sharp divide between the wealthy and the poor, stray figures huddled in alleys, and she remembered Ralph mentioning that strength was everything in this world. Inequality was impossible to ignore. A small boy suddenly bumped into her, mumbling an apology before dashing off. The child's bright energy made Haruka's chest feel strangely warm. But before she could smile, Ralph sprinted after the boy and caught him roughly. He ordered the kid to return what he'd stolen. The boy hesitated, then shoved something into Ralph's hand before fleeing down the street. It was Haruka's notebook. She hadn't even realized it was gone. Ralph sighed, explaining that street kids from the slums often picked pockets to survive. They might have mistaken it for a wallet. Haruka felt a pang of pity rather than anger. When they reached the Adventurers Guild, a cheerful receptionist greeted them. She handed Haruka a registration form. Strangely enough, Haruka could read and understand the local language perfectly, but when she reached the age section, she froze. She didn't know how old she was. Ralph quickly explained that Haruka suffered from amnesia. The receptionist flipped through a handbook and mentioned that dark elves typically reached adulthood at 18, marked by wearing ear cuffs. She suggested Haruka write 17 instead, just to be safe. After paying the registration fee, the receptionist told her that her adventurer tag would be ready by evening and recommended she join the new adventurer training session later that day. As they left, Haruka couldn't help wondering why Ralph was being so kind to her. Ralph blinked, rubbed the back of his neck, and admitted it was just a gut feeling. Haruka didn't look convinced, so Ralph added honestly that the moment he'd met her, he'd been overwhelmed, not just by her immense magical presence, but also by how beautiful she looked. Blushing, Ralph laughed nervously and confessed he might have fallen in love at first sight. Haruka froze. Deep down, she was still the same middle-aged man from her old world, and she had no idea how to respond. After a long pause, she muttered not to expect too much from her. Ralph smiled anyway, saying he didn't want anything in return. He just wanted to help. Then he mentioned that he'd already booked her room for an entire week before heading off. Feeling guilty, Haruka wondered how expensive the inn was and decided she needed to start earning money soon. She spent the afternoon in the library, studying whatever she could. Later that day, she arrived early for the adventurer training session. The room was empty until a quiet boy entered. He had fox-like ears and a hooded cloak. A beast man, Haruka guessed. Without greeting, he sat down and began arranging small stones on the desk, seemingly lost in concentration. Two more arrived soon after, a young girl and a boy. Both stopped in surprise when they saw Haruka, the mysterious dark elf among them. Surrounded by these bright, youthful faces, Haruka couldn't help feeling awkward and out of place. Their instructor arrived next, a young woman in a witch's hat. When Haruka looked closer, she realized it was the same girl who had been staring at her in the dining hall that morning. Still, the woman carried herself professionally and introduced herself as Eri, a third-class adventurer. She began the lesson, explaining that this world was home to many races: humans, beastmen, dwarves, elves, all collectively called people. On the other side were the destroyers: mermaids, lizardmen, goblins, vampires, giants, and countless other dangerous beings. It was the adventurer's duty to fight them. Listening to her words, Haruka felt both excitement and dread. The idea of wielding magic thrilled her, but the thought of fighting terrified her. She'd never been good with violence. She'd always been the cowardly type, the kind of person who survived by avoiding trouble. Perhaps adventuring wasn't for someone like her. As class ended, she quietly stood to leave, already planning a safer way to live. But before she could step outside, the three young adventurers stopped her, their faces flushed with nervous energy. With hesitant yet hopeful voices, they asked if she would form a party with them and go on adventures together. A cheerful, reckless-looking boy introduced himself as Albert. He was only 14, the son of a former adventurer. The girl beside him, Corin, seemed to be his childhood friend. The way she teased him by saying he's the type who dies easily made that obvious. Next came a beastman who introduced himself as Montana. Strangely, he claimed to be a dwarven blacksmith. Albert blinked in confusion, so Montana explained. When he was little, a giant bird abducted him, and he was later rescued and raised by a dwarf who became his adoptive father. Everyone's attention soon turned to Haruka, who had been silently watching their lively introductions. With a hesitant smile, she gave her name, nothing more. The kids' enthusiasm was infectious. Their energy radiated like fireworks, and despite herself, Haruka couldn't say no when they invited her to form a party together. The group immediately buzzed with excitement, talking about Haruka's ability to use magic and Montana's skill with daggers. Their chatter drowned out Haruka's attempt to explain that she'd rather work quietly in town. Her anxiety built up until, at last, she slammed the table and declared she'd think about it overnight. Without waiting for their response, she rushed off. But just as she turned a corner, a sword came flying straight at her. It barely missed, lodging itself into a nearby wall. A panicked young boy ran over, bowing and apologizing. The weapon had slipped from his hand during practice. Looking around, Haruka realized she was standing near a training ground, filled with adventurers sparring and practicing sword techniques. Most were swordsmen, but not far away. Another area was dedicated to magicians. There, she spotted a young girl practicing magic with intense focus. Her spells were weak, fizzling midair, and her expression twisted with pain. Concerned, Haruka approached and asked if she was all right. The girl managed a tired smile, saying it was just magic intoxication, a kind of headache from channeling too much mana through the brain. Her current limit was only 5 or 6 spells at most. Deciding to rest, she offered Haruka the training spot. She wasn't particularly interested at first, but then again, it wouldn't hurt to see what her limits were. Around her, young mages were casting simple fire arrows, pausing to rest after only a few shots. Haruka focused, reciting the incantation under her breath. From her fingertip, a swirling flame took shape. She willed it to solidify into an arrow, its blazing tip quivering with restrained heat. Drawing a slow breath, she pointed at the target and released it. The arrow shot forward and exploded dead center. A chill ran down her spine. Not fear, but exhilaration. She didn't stop there. She cast spell after spell, wind, water, fire again, each one sharper, faster, stronger. The other mages began to gather, whispering in awe as they watched her work. Haruka barely noticed their stares. Laughter burst out of her, pure and unrestrained. For the first time in 40 years, Haruka felt alive. When she finally stopped, the crowd had grown thick behind her. She'd fired at least 50 shots, and not once had she felt the usual magic intoxication. A wave of relief washed over her. At least now she knew she wouldn't slow down any future teammates. Still, she shook the thought away. She wasn't planning to become an adventurer. Just as she turned to leave, a familiar voice called out. It was Eri, appearing out of nowhere. She looked straight at Haruka and said she wanted to talk. Eri brought Haruka to a small, inexpensive cafe hidden at the edge of the market district. She carried over a simple bowl of bread and sausages, then began assembling them into a makeshift hot dog, adding vegetables and a generous amount of sauce. The result looked rough, but Eri ate it without complaint, her movements casual and practiced. She urged Haruka to eat, assuring her that the meal was on her, but the dark elf remained hesitant. Her confusion showed when she reminded Eri that their meeting had been meant for discussion, not dining. Realizing her mistake, Eri quickly apologized, explaining that she had no intention of appearing overbearing. The real purpose of their meeting soon surfaced. Eri asked about Haruka's relationship with Ralph, having seen the two of them walking together earlier that morning. The question carried a sharp edge, one that made Haruka briefly suspect jealousy. She clarified that Ralph had merely offered her help and that there was nothing romantic between them. Eri seemed relieved. Wiping the sauce from her lips, she expressed that it was for the best, warning Haruka to stay away from him. Ralph, she explained, had a bad habit of toying with women, and one of her friends had once been driven to tears because of him. Her expression darkened as she spoke, and Haruka, though silent, sensed the truth in her words. She had already noticed the same reckless charm in Ralph's demeanor, the kind that belonged to men who played with hearts as if it were a game. After a pause, Eri shifted the topic, asking whether Haruka was wealthy, because the inn she stayed in is super expensive. The question startled the elf, who nearly confessed in tears that it was being paid for by Ralph. This revelation earned another sigh from Eri, who immediately advised her to cancel the arrangement before she fell into deeper debt. She recommended that Haruka move to the guild dormitory instead, and even offered to handle the transfer on her behalf. To make things easier, she promised to lend Haruka money for the time being. Haruka tried to refuse, unwilling to accept such kindness, but Eri's patience had run out. Her expression hardened as she explained that she had personal reasons for wanting to interfere. Her friend's pain still lingered, and she wanted to teach Ralph a lesson. Faced with her determination, Haruka could no longer argue. When Haruka finally tasted the drink Eri had ordered, her expression twisted in surprise and disgust. The flavor was strange, almost bitter, and the reaction made Eri laugh openly. It was, after all, a cheap cafe. Such flavor was to be expected. The tension between them slowly eased. For the first time, Haruka saw a lighter side of Eri, less intimidating, more ordinary, and far closer to her own age. They spoke for a long while after that, and the conversation gradually grew easier. Haruka mentioned her amnesia, and Eri listened with quiet curiosity. The two of them ended up spending the afternoon together, walking around the city, sampling strange foods such as roasted bat frog skewers that looked grotesque, yet tasted surprisingly good. By evening, they arrived at the guild dormitory to begin Haruka's registration. Eri apologized for keeping her so long, but Haruka expressed genuine gratitude. For her, the day had been unexpectedly pleasant. Before they parted, Eri hesitated, then asked if Haruka would consider joining her team. She mentioned that it was an all-girls group, one she believed Haruka would fit well with. The proposal, however, only deepened Haruka's uncertainty. The kids earlier that day had already invited her to join their group, though she had not yet given them an answer. Despite their kindness, doubt clouded her thoughts. She was older than most of them, weary and directionless, and she wondered whether she truly belonged among the energetic and hopeful. Her life had been filled with indecision and failed attempts at choosing her own path. The hesitation lingered until Eri spoke again, snapping her out of her silence. She told Haruka not to worry so much and to try working with them once before deciding. Haruka, she said, was diligent, serious, and skilled in magic, all qualities valuable to a beginner's team. There was truth in that observation. Deep down, Haruka realized she wanted to join those kids, though she lacked the courage to admit it. When she finally did, Eri smiled faintly, noting how little confidence the elf seemed to have. She repeated her offer, saying that her own team would always have room for Haruka should she change her mind. The dark elf thanked her sincerely, though Eri brushed off the formality, insisting they were friends now. The word struck Haruka more deeply than expected. She had not anticipated forming a friendship so soon. Afterward, they headed toward the guild's quest board. Eri noticed someone familiar in the crowd and offered to accompany Haruka, but the elf declined, assuring her she could manage on her own. Eri relented, though her knowing expression suggested an unspoken warning. Haruka approached the board and began scanning the available requests. A tall, broad-shouldered man stood beside her, his gaze sharp and assessing. After a long moment, he spoke in a tone heavy with suspicion, asking whether she was Ralph's new woman. Before she could even respond, Several of his companions appeared, laughing and making crude remarks about Ralph's interesting taste. Haruka denied the accusation, insisting there was nothing between them. But Eri's earlier warning echoed in her mind. It was already too late. She had stepped into Ralph's shadow without meaning to. Sighing, she tried to de-escalate, asking them not to trouble her and promising to stay out of their way. Yet her attempt at peace was taken as an insult. The man's expression turned cold, his pride wounded by her words. Before she could step back, he seized her arm. His grip tightened, his voice low and sharp. He told her he would teach her a lesson. Tado, a towering man with a constant scowl, dragged Haruka into a narrow alley, followed by his jeering companions. His glare brimmed with disdain, as if the dark elf before him were something less than human. Haruka, tense but composed, tried to explain herself. She did not avoid confrontation out of cowardice, but simply because she despised unnecessary violence. With quiet humility, she bowed deeply, her tone polite and subdued, apologizing if she had made them uncomfortable and admitting she had no money to offer should they demand compensation. Her calm only deepened Tado's anger. Irritation twisted into cruelty as he sneered, suggesting she could pay in another way if she had no coin. The elf instinctively stepped back, her expression restrained, but her body alert. She told him flatly that if he tried to touch her again, she would not hold back. That was all it took for Tado to lose control. Fury distorted his features as he mocked her, daring her to fight. In his mind, a rookie adventurer like her could never stand a chance. Haruka hesitated, assessing the situation. She needed a spell that could defend without killing. Fire was far too dangerous, its damage too absolute. Water, then. During training, she had never unleashed her full strength, but perhaps with a new chant, she could control it. She took a steady breath, focusing her mana. Water began to swirl in her palm, a liquid vortex gathering and thickening under her will. She guided it to multiply, and soon 4 glowing orbs hovered in the air before her. Tado's companions burst into laughter at the sight. To them, a few balls of water were a joke, nothing more than a feeble trick, but Tado did not laugh. His instincts screamed at him to move, to run. His friends did not understand why. Sweat gathered on his forehead. Most mages could only cast 1 spell at a time. Even the rare adventurers capable of handling 3 were considered prodigies, triple spellcasters, monsters of special rank. Yet the elf before him stood effortlessly controlling 4, her face calm and unreadable. Without hesitation, Haruka released the spell. The water bullets streaked forward with a sharp hiss, slicing through the air. Tado raised an arm in reflex, but the liquid pierced through his defense, wrapping tightly around his head like a transparent helmet. The force of impact threw him backward. His companions rushed forward in panic, only to be struck by the remaining orbs. Within seconds, all 4 men collapsed to the ground, struggling and gasping as water choked their breath. Then, silence. Haruka stood motionless, her gaze fixed on their fallen forms. The adrenaline drained from her body, replaced by a cold, hollow stillness. For a long moment, she simply stared, her mind blank. She did not notice Eri's footsteps until her friend's voice broke the silence. Eri had feared she would arrive too late, but instead found the elf standing pale and trembling among 4 unconscious men. Haruka's face had gone completely white. Horror crept through her expression as realization struck. She might have killed them. She clutched Eri's arm tightly, her body shaking with panic. She had never wanted to harm anyone. Eri checked the bodies and exhaled in relief. They were alive, only unconscious. Taking Haruka gently by the wrist, she urged her away from the scene. Haruka think, if her magic slipped further from her control, she could easily take a life without meaning to. Halfway down the alley, Haruka stopped abruptly. She turned back, a spark of dread crossing her face. If the men did not cough up the water trapped inside them, they could still die. Without hesitation, she ran back and knelt beside Tado, rolling his heavy frame onto his side and striking his back several times with growing urgency. Seconds dragged on until at last Tado convulsed, coughing violently as water poured from his mouth like a drowning man returning to air. Relief washed through her as he gasped weakly. She helped him sit upright, though her anxious attempt to wake him again resulted in a slap too harsh, leaving a red mark across his cheek. Moments later, Tado's eyelids fluttered. He blinked in confusion, only to freeze as he saw the dark elf kneeling before him. Haruka's face was drawn with remorse. She bowed her head deeply, intent on apologizing. But Tado misunderstood entirely. He saw the gesture as a silent threat, a warning that she was ready to strike again. Terrified, he fell to his knees, stammering apologies and promises to never repeat his mistake. Eri observed the absurd scene unfold with a quiet exhale, half exasperated and half amused. She accepted Tado's desperate offer to treat them to a meal before Haruka could refuse. They ended up at a cafe, far more expensive than Tado could afford. Eri ordered freely, filling the table with meats, breads, and sweets, while Tado drowned his shame in mug after mug of ale. Between gulps, he kept apologizing to Haruka, addressing her as Big Sis, with drunken sincerity. The title sounded ridiculous for her who used to be an old man. As the night wore on, Tado spoke of his frustrations. He confessed to having once loved a childhood friend who now favored Ralph. Jealousy had driven him to foolish boasting, claiming he was stronger, only to be mocked for his low rank. The humiliation had curdled into anger, and that anger had been misdirected toward the wrong person. Eri teased him mercilessly, mocking the childish jealousy that had caused so much trouble. By the time the meal ended, the bitterness of their encounter had faded into something lighter. From that day on, Tado and his companions began following Haruka around. Tado started treating and respect her like an older sister. The sight of a burly man calling a slender dark elf Big Sis became a source of amusement among other adventurers. Morning light spilled across the room when Haruka woke, her clothes clinging uncomfortably to her skin. They hadn't yet turned unpleasant, but she needed a change soon. Still, before taking care of that, she had something else to do. Meet Albert and the others, and give them her final answer about joining their party. Stepping out of her room, she came face to face with a young woman standing gracefully in the corridor. The stranger had blonde hair tied into twin tails, a calm smile, and wore an elegant gown that shimmered faintly with gold threads. Her demeanor was refined, almost regal. Haruka paused, uncertain who she was or how she knew her name. The girl apologized softly for startling her, then introduced herself as Valerie, master of the Golden Wings clan. She explained that she had heard of Haruka through Eri. The revelation struck the dark elf with surprise. Valerie was no ordinary adventurer. She was a first-class adventurer, a rank few could ever hope to reach, and Eri's direct superior. In the guild hierarchy, small independent party formed the lowest tier, taking on scattered requests. Above them stood teams, fixed parties officially registered with the guild. At the top were clans, organizations recognized by the guild and composed of multiple teams, existing only in the major cities. Worried she might have caused some kind of trouble, Haruka asked carefully if there was a problem. Valerie only smiled and explained that she merely wished to greet her, and had brought a small gift. Leaning in with a hint of mischief, she whispered that it was something Haruka would surely need in underwear. Haruka froze in stunned silence. Valerie, clearly amused by her reaction, offered a polite farewell and departed with effortless grace, leaving the dark elf holding the gift behind. Unease crept over her. The idea of a first-class adventurer gifting her underwear felt far too strange. Deciding it was best not to dwell on it, she left the package in her room and went downstairs to find Albert. The dining hall was far from peaceful. Eri and Ralph stood facing each other across the room, their voices sharp and filled with tension. Eri demanded that Ralph keep his distance from Haruka, while Ralph refused to be ordered around. Before the conflict could escalate, Haruka stepped between them and lowered her head in apology to Ralph for the trouble she had caused him. The gesture caught Tado's attention from across the hall. He could not stand seeing his big sister bowing to anyone. One of Tado's friends pointed accusingly at Ralph, assuming he was trying to take advantage of Haruka. Enraged, Tado confronted him directly, warning him not to lay a hand on her. Eri sighed and muttered something under her breath about womanizers and thugs being no different. The air around them grew heavier with hostility, their words turning sharper with every exchange. Haruka could only stand frozen between them, her composure faltering under the growing pressure. Meanwhile, Korin had gone to fetch Albert, reminding him of their appointment to meet Haruka that morning. On their way, they encountered Montana, and the three decided to head to the dining hall together. Upon entering, they found the place unusually crowded. Someone mentioned a fight breaking out, and when they looked closer, they saw Haruka caught in the middle of the commotion. Korin called out to her, and relief washed over the dark elf's face. She approached them quickly, asking them to wait while she resolved the situation. Albert, Korin, and Montana found seats nearby, curiosity drawing their eyes to the confrontation. Albert said to a man beside them that they had invited Haruka to join their party the previous day. The man only laughed, remarking that the argument looked more like high-ranking adventurers fighting over her. With veterans like that involved, he said, there was little chance she would join a group of rookies. Albert fell silent, troubled by the thought, but Corin placed a hand on his shoulder, reminding him that the decision was not theirs to make. Across the hall, Haruka turned her gaze toward the three waiting for her. Their anxious expressions betrayed their doubt. They feared she might choose someone else. A quiet resolve settled in her heart. From the beginning, she had already made her choice. She stepped forward, her calm voice cutting through the tension. She declared that she had decided to join Albert's team and had no intention of joining anyone else. Yet, she added, she hoped everyone could get along and that there would be no more conflict because of her. Excited cheers erupted from the three rookies. Montana's tail wagged energetically like that of a jubilant dog. Ralph, however, stood silent, his disappointment visible though he said nothing. As Haruka turned to Ralph, thanking him once again for his kindness, and apologizing for the debt she could not repay, Ralph gave her a faint smile before departing, telling her quietly that if she ever faced trouble again, she should rely on him first. Then he left the guild as calmly as he had arrived. Eri let out an exasperated sigh, muttering about smooth-talking men and their endless charm. When the hall finally quieted, Tato approached Haruka with a small bundle in his hands. Inside were clean clothes he had prepared for her, having remembered her saying she had none left. The gesture warmed her heart. So much had happened in only a few days. Confusion, tension, and unexpected kindness. Yet amid it all, she had found new companions and a place to belong. Albert suddenly remembered something. A faint smile crossed his face as he extended his hand toward her. From that moment onward, they would move forward together as a team. A few moments later, Haruka had already begun to adapt to her new life in another world. Today, she was asked to help lift some heavy supplies. The men around her looked worried. Surely, a slim elf girl couldn't handle that weight. But to everyone's shock, Haruka lifted it effortlessly. The workers stared, wide-eyed, before bursting into laughter and cheers. Their job had just gotten a whole lot easier. 3 months had passed since Haruka registered as an adventurer. Nearby, a few townsfolk were struggling with some complicated calculations, and they called her over for help. Thanks to her old life as a salesman, she solved it with ease. Bit by bit, she was making friends, paying off her debts, and earning respect. Life was going smoothly. She couldn't help smiling to herself, but her cheerful grin only made others whisper that she must be some kind of super elf who found everything too easy. Not far away, Albert watched her surrounded by people, his expression a little gloomy. He sighed deeply. Behind him, Corin chuckled, whispering that Albert was probably jealous since Haruka was getting all the action. The boy flinched, caught off guard. Corin laughed harder. She knew him too well. They'd grown up together, and she could read his every thought just from his face. Albert sighed again. He wasn't jealous in a bad way. He just couldn't help feeling that it was unfair. Haruka was smart, strong, and could even use magic. Recently, they'd discovered that she unconsciously used body enhancement magic without realizing it. How could anyone compete with that? Corin told him to work harder instead of complaining. But before Albert could respond, a heavy crate from the second floor suddenly slipped and fell. Corin, standing directly below, didn't have time to react. The townspeople screamed. Albert turned, running to save her, but Haruka was faster. She leapt forward, shielding Corin with her body. A splash of red spread across Haruka's head. Corin froze, horrified of the blood. But Haruka only smiled in relief that Corin was unharmed. When the others rushed over in panic, Haruka calmly wiped her face, revealing it wasn't blood at all. It was red wine from a shattered bottle. Everyone gasped in disbelief, half in shock and half in admiration. She was completely unhurt. Her reflexes were praised all around, though inside her heart was still racing. Albert watched from afar, wanting to check if she was okay, but the situation forced him to go back to work, a quiet sadness settling in his chest. Later that day, inside the guild's dining hall, Haruka spotted Albert sitting gloomily and asked what was wrong. He frowned, admitting that this wasn't the kind of adventuring life he'd imagined. He'd joined the guild to explore and fight monsters, but all their quests so far had just been helping villagers. Haruka understood. She wanted to go on a real adventure too, but things weren't that simple. Corin teased Albert, saying that attitude was exactly why he was still stuck at rank 8. Corin herself had recently moved up to rank 7, and Montana, who mostly worked in the workshop, had already reached rank 6. Haruka, on the other hand, had just been promoted to rank 5. Albert wanted to congratulate her, but stayed quiet, still sulking. Seeing that, Haruka smiled and suggested they take on a higher-level quest together. Since she was rank 5 now, her team could accept tougher missions, something closer to what Albert had always wanted. At that, Albert's eyes lit up. He jumped from his seat and dashed straight to the quest board, like a kid on his birthday. The others laughed, but let him be. Haruka didn't mind either. She found his childish enthusiasm kind of refreshing, something she'd long forgotten how to feel herself. Montana stood up next, saying he'd go check on that overexcited kid. But as he walked off, his tail wagged happily, making Haruka and Korin laugh. In the end, they all joined him to look at the quest board. Albert soon found the perfect one for the group, a hunt scheduled for the next day. That night, Haruka couldn't sleep. Her heart raced with both nerves and excitement. She sat up, reviewing the details again. Sunset Forest. Hunt down the horn boar. A mutated creature, half boar and half monster, with a single sharp horn born from magical corruption. Dangerous, yes, but its meat, fur, and tusk were valuable resources. They wouldn't go too deep into the forest, though. The inner regions were said to be crawling with destructors and the undead. Haruka tried to calm her worries. She told herself she could handle it. She had to. The next morning, they set out, energy buzzing in the air. Albert was especially thrilled, but Haruka noticed the group seemed a little lost. When she pointed out the west gate, Albert turned red with embarrassment. None of them could read maps. With a sigh, Haruka took the lead, navigating their way into the forest. It was their first real expedition. The forest was vast and alive with strange noises. Suddenly, something rustled in the bushes. Out jumped a creature, its long ears sharp as blades. A killer rabbit. Albert, curious, pushed through the bushes despite Korin's warning not to wander off. Montana's beastman ears twitched. Something big was approaching. Then, Albert's shout rang out. He stumbled from the undergrowth, panic on his face. He yelled to run. Behind him crashed a massive beast, the horn boar. The team froze at the sight of it. The creature was enormous, far larger than they'd imagined. They screamed and bolted. Korin shouted angrily, demanding why Albert had led the monster straight to them. But the boy was just as terrified. He'd only been peeking through the bushes when their eyes met, and then it charged. Now the group was torn. Should they retreat back to town? Haruka clenched her fists. They couldn't just keep running forever. But even she wasn't sure. Was this really a horn boar? It looked similar, but it was far too big. As panic spread among the young adventurers, one thing became painfully clear. None of them had expected their first real adventure to turn into a desperate chase for their lives. Haruka turned to look behind her, confirming the creature's shape. According to the bestiary, a horn boar was no larger than a piglet. Yet what loomed before her now was nearly the size of a small truck, a towering mass of muscle and rage tearing through the forest. She quickly assessed the situation. Engaging it head-on was out of the question. Remembering that boars were poor at turning, Haruka signaled her companions to scatter in a zigzag pattern. Korin called out for Montana to take the lead. The boy reacted instantly, darting through the trees and veering sharply to the right. But to their dismay, the boar maneuvered just as swiftly, its enormous body cutting through obstacles as it pursued them relentlessly. Splintered branches and crushed trunks marked its path of destruction. Montana noticed the beast's tusks grazing against trees, slowing it slightly. He recalled a massive oak standing further ahead and quickly formulated a plan. If the creature collided with that tree, it would be trapped long enough for them to strike. Though the others hesitated, Montana's calm confidence steadied their nerves. Even Haruka found herself reassured. The boy possessed remarkable composure for his age. They reached the colossal tree moments later. Albert's voice rose in alarm, urging Haruka to move aside, but she refused to retreat. If the boar avoided the impact, their only chance would vanish. Strengthening her body with enhancement magic, she positioned herself directly in its path. The creature thundered closer, its snarling echo filling the forest. Haruka swallowed her fear. Then, at the final instant, she leapt away. The horn boar crashed headlong into the tree with a deafening impact. The ground trembled beneath them as dust and leaves scattered through the air. Their plan had succeeded. Korin and Montana shouted in triumph, while Albert hurried to pull Haruka up from the dirt. Without hesitation, he began his magic incantation to finish the beast. Montana struck first, slashing at the monster's legs, but his blade barely scratched its hide. "It's too tough," he muttered, his breath ragged. Albert ignored the complaint, continuing his attack. The creature could no longer move, and that alone gave them an advantage. Yet even repeated strikes left no visible wounds. Haruka observed quietly, studying its form. The creature was massive, its flesh dense and resilient. Brute force would not suffice. She steadied her breathing and began to gather wind around her palms. Blades of air shimmered faintly as the pressure built. At her side, Korin drew her bow. Her arrows struck one after another, bouncing harmlessly off the creature's hide. Even the one aimed at its eye only enraged it further. Still, Haruka focused on her incantation, weaving each word with precision. She needed power sharp enough to cut, yet controlled enough to spare her companions. A sudden crack echoed through the forest. One of Korin's arrows pierced the creature's eye, sending it into a violent frenzy. The massive tree behind it began to splinter under its thrashing. Haruka raised her hand. The wind coiled tightly in her grasp, silent, sharp, and invisible. Then she released it. A faint gust swept past, light and fleeting, like a passing breeze. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the beast's movements froze. Its head slid cleanly from its shoulders, falling with a heavy thud. Blood gushed across the forest floor as the enormous body collapsed, bringing the shattered tree down with it. For several seconds, none of them spoke. The sheer scale of what had just happened left them stunned. Haruka herself stood still, unsure whether to feel pride or disbelief. Then Albert broke the stillness with a shout of astonished admiration. The others gathered around, their awe quickly turning to exhilaration. Their first major hunt had ended in complete victory. The thought of bringing such a trophy back to the guild filled them with pride and relief. For Haruka, it was proof that she was not a burden to the team, that she belonged among them. Their excitement, however, gave way to a new problem: the beast's massive size. Transporting it back to town would be impossible without dismantling it first. Before they could decide on a solution, a group of adventurers appeared, drawn by the noise. Leading them was Andre, a seasoned adventurer and an acquaintance of Albert's. He approached, startled by the sight of the fallen creature. His expression shifted from disbelief to astonishment. He murmured, asking if Albert teamed defeat the monster. Albert nodded with pride. Andre studied the corpse in silence, then pointed to the two horns protruding from its skull. The truth became clear soon after. What they had believed to be an ordinary hornboar was, in fact, a tyrant boar, a far stronger and more dangerous variant. The creature was considered a lethal threat to anyone below the 4th rank, and an emergency request had been issued earlier that morning to subdue it. By sheer circumstance, the newly registered group had accomplished the task first. The younger adventurers froze in collective shock. Even Albert, who had been beaming moments before, could only stare in disbelief. Andre, however, laughed lightly, impressed by their feat. Their success would elevate their ranks significantly. The realization left the group nearly speechless with joy. Albert's usual composure broke completely as he embraced Montana in unrestrained excitement. Andre could only shake his head in amusement at their childish celebration. When the moment settled, Albert turned to Haruka with a grin, seeking silent acknowledgement. She looked at him for a moment, his hopeful expression almost like a loyal puppy's, before gently patting his head. His face brightened instantly. Korin and Montana, watching the exchange, stepped closer with expectant looks of their own. Haruka sighed softly, but smiled all the same, brushing her hands through their hair as well. The three of them beamed like overjoyed children basking in praise. Andre's voice interrupted the moment, reminding them to return to the guild and report their success. He would handle the logistics of retrieving the monster's remains. And so their first true adventure came to an end. What began as a desperate struggle concluded in triumph, a moment that marked the beginning of their rise as real adventurers. In the days that followed, Haruka reached rank 4, Montana and Korin were each promoted to rank 5. Albert, though still at rank 6 due to a lack of previous achievements. But for now, it was enough. A few days later, on a lively afternoon in the city center, Haruka was found asleep on a park bench. The murmur of people and distant clatter of hooves stirred her awake. She straightened her back, rubbed her eyes, and blinked in confusion. Somehow, she had fallen asleep in the middle of her walk. After checking her pockets and finding everything intact, she exhaled in relief. It was a rare day off, granted after their victory over the tyrant boar. For once, she had time to simply wander. As she made her way down the crowded streets, she caught sight of a familiar figure. It's Montana. He appeared calm as ever, carrying a small bag filled with trinkets and ornaments. He was on his way to the market street to sell a few accessories, and Haruka decided to accompany him. Halfway along the route, Montana came to an unexpected stop. The sudden stillness made Haruka glance back, wondering if something was wrong. He remained silent for a few moments before resuming his pace without a word. When they reached the market, the street was already alive with energy. Merchants called out their offers, carts rattled over cobblestones, and the scent of baked bread drifted through the air. Montana found an empty corner, spread a mat across the ground, and arranged several handmade accessories upon it. Rings, bracelets, and earrings that shimmered softly under the afternoon sun. Then he sat down, quiet and composed. Haruka sat beside him, watching. He did not advertise his goods, nor call to potential buyers. Instead, he simply observed the passing crowd, content in the silence. There was an unexpected serenity in the moment, a kind of peace Haruka had long forgotten. Once, as a salaryman in another world, she had never known such stillness. After a while, a young man approached, eyes bright with anticipation. He examined the accessories with care and chose a simple ring. When asked for the price, Montana merely gestured for him to pay what he could. The young man hesitated, then emptied his pouch, offering a small pile of copper and a few silver coins. Montana accepted only half, returning the rest. The man left with a radiant smile, clutching the ring as if it were priceless. From his expression, Haruka could tell it was meant for someone dear to him. Not long after, an elderly nobleman arrived. He looked over the items with quiet interest before laying down several gold coins. Montana accepted them casually, showing no surprise. When Haruka questioned the unevenness of the prices, he only replied that he did not set them. He decided by looking. A commotion soon broke out nearby. Another nobleman was berating a poor vendor, tossing his wares aside in disgust. His arrogance filled the air like poison. Spotting Montana's stall, he strode over with a sneer, demanding to see the merchandise. When he laid eyes on the accessories, his manner shifted instantly to greed. He declared that he would buy everything at once. Montana refused. The shop, he said, was closed. The noble grew irritated, offering higher sums, promising fame and favor. But Montana remained unmoved. He began packing up his wares in silence. Insulted by the indifference, the noble mocked the beastman's animal ears, calling them mere decoration. Montana's movements froze, replaced by a cold, cutting stillness. When he spoke again, his voice was low and sharp, warning the man to leave. The noble, enraged, seized Montana by the collar, arm drawn back to strike. But before the blow could land, Montana moved. With swift, fluid precision, he slipped free of the man's grip, vaulted upward, and pressed a blade against the noble's neck. The blade's edge caught the light, glinting near the man's glasses, a silent threat that froze him in place. For a heartbeat, Haruka held her breath, mesmerized. Then Montana released him and stepped back. The noble stumbled and fell, gasping in shock. Without another glance, Montana turned to leave. Haruka followed as they slipped into a narrow alleyway that led away from the market's noise. He stopped again, motionless for a time, as if waiting. Moments later, a young boy emerged from a nearby house, running toward him with panic in his eyes. The boy clutched 2 copper coins tightly in his hands. He had saved them through hard work, hoping it would be enough to buy a small gift. Montana listened quietly, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a delicate pair of earrings. He handed them to the boy, saying they were a special opening. The boy's face lit up with joy. He thanked Montana with all his heart before hurrying off, promising to give the earrings to his mother. As Haruka watched him disappear down the alley, she realized the reason Montana had lingered earlier. He had been waiting for the child. A quiet laugh escaped her, touched by the simplicity of his kindness. She let out a small laugh, then asked if she could tag along with Montana to sell things again sometime. The beastman gave a faint smile and said of course. Haruka would be more than welcome. His ears twitched a little, showing how happy he was. After their break ended, the group returned to their hornboar hunting quest. Albert watched in disbelief as Haruka effortlessly lifted one of the monsters. Even though Albert kept himself fit, carrying just one was enough to wear him out. Then, Corin's scream broke the air. Everyone thought something bad had happened, but it turned out she was just shocked. Montana had traveled alone all the way from Dathart to Orans, a pretty long journey. Albert laughed it off and told Haruka that he once traveled with Korin and her father, since the man was a merchant. Curious, he asked Haruka if she had ever traveled anywhere before. The elf's answer came out awkward and unsure. She never had. Albert's curiosity only grew. How did she even end up in Orans from her elf village? Haruka's face went blank, like she didn't know how to respond. Albert tried again, asking about her parents. Were they adventurers too? But that only made her more uncomfortable. She went silent, and Albert could sense something strange. Before he could press further, the man who had hired them asked if the area was clear of monsters. Albert quickly replied that it was safe, and the man could return to his woodcutting. Taking advantage of the moment, Haruka lifted several hornboars at once and carried them off. Albert stood there, watching the dark elf with a quiet sense of awe. Later, he realized that whenever they talked about their past or their future, Haruka only listened, nodding politely, offering just enough to keep up with the group. It was obvious. She rarely talked about herself. That night, they gathered for dinner, celebrating Albert's 15th birthday. The troublemaker had finally reached rank 5, catching up with his friends. At that age, people were considered adults, and Albert was eager to drink like one. Korin was happy too, calmer, but clearly glad everyone had finally come of age. Montana, being a year older, was already used to it. The dinner was lively and warm, filled with laughter and clinking glasses. But 2 hours later, all three were completely wasted. Korin was the only one still holding it together, clearly annoyed at how drunk they'd gotten. Haruka felt a bit dizzy and decided to step outside for some fresh air. Outside, near the bridge by the river, she leaned against the railing. The night breeze cooled her cheeks as the spinning in her head slowly faded. She had drunk more than usual, simply because she'd been enjoying herself. In her past, drinking was part of work, never something fun. Tonight felt different. It warmed her heart in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. Still, she reminded herself that she was much older than them. She shouldn't show such an embarrassing side. Taking a deep breath, she told herself to be more careful and headed back to the tavern. Inside, Albert had woken up and was already reaching for another drink. Korin snatched it away before he could take another sip, telling him to talk clearly first. Albert frowned, then admitted he'd been thinking about Haruka. He said she never really talked about her past, even though they often shared stories, at least in bits and pieces. Haruka, who had just reached the door, stopped. She realized she'd never told them she had amnesia, even if it was only a made-up excuse. That explained why Albert often asked her so many questions about herself. He wasn't being forgetful, she'd simply never told them. Albert sighed and asked Korin if Haruka even needed them at all. His tone was quiet, almost sad. But because Haruka couldn't see his expression, she misunderstood. He went on, wondering if maybe Haruka didn't trust them, despite being part of the same team. Korin tried to reassure him, saying they'd gotten along fine for a month now, but Albert still looked uneasy. Korin could tell. He felt there was a wall between them. Montana just shrugged, saying that's just how Haruka was. But Albert shook his head. He understood Haruka was different and didn't blame her for that, but he cared about her as a friend. What if she only saw them as co-workers, not friends? Sometimes, he said, he just couldn't tell what she was thinking. Korin's chest tightened. She didn't want any cracks forming in their team, so she told Albert to go wash his face and clear his head. When they opened the door, Haruka was already standing there. Albert froze, realizing she'd heard everything. Before he could say a word, Haruka turned and walked away, despite them calling after her. Korin groaned and smacked Albert on the shoulder, yelling at him to go after her and apologize. But Haruka was already gone, her heart heavy with regret. She had run off without thinking. It had been the perfect chance to finally explain her amnesia, but she hadn't known what they truly thought of her. She never imagined they'd been worrying about something like that. Now, as she wandered aimlessly through the quiet city streets, her thoughts drifted to her past, memories she wished she could forget, but which clung to her all the same. Since childhood, Haruka had always loved books. He could lose himself in their worlds, dazzling battles, magic filled with wonder, and bonds built on trust and friendship. He believed that if he simply did the right thing, Like the heroes he admired, he too could make friends. But reality hit harder than he ever expected. As he grew up, the people around him began to tease him. They said the things he talked about were too serious, too boring, and eventually they left him behind. Once, when he tried to stand up for a classmate who was being left out, his words backfired. The others mocked the boy even more, claiming it was all just play. Guilt consumed Haruka. When he tried to help, the poor boy slapped him hand away, tears streaming down his face, angry, hurt, and blaming Haruka for everything. His parents were kind, but always busy. Work came first, leaving little time to listen to their son's worries. Haruka didn't want anyone else to get hurt because of him, but he also didn't want to be hated by everyone, or disappoint his family. So he learned to stay quiet. In high school, someone confessed to him. He didn't know her well, but not wanting to hurt her feelings, he accepted. Over time, he grew to genuinely love her. Yet one day, she asked if he even liked her at all. Haruka seemed distant, expressionless, indifferent. The truth was, he was terrified of making mistakes and hurting her by accident. But instead of explaining, he stayed silent. His silence convinced her even more that he didn't care. She broke down, saying she could never understand what he was thinking. After they broke up, they never spoke again. Years later, after he started working, both his parents died in an accident. Left completely alone, Haruka shut himself off from the world. He didn't want to hurt anyone, and he didn't want to be hurt. But he wasn't skilled enough to live without others, leaving him trapped between fear and loneliness. Those painful memories haunted her, no matter how far she ran. Even after crossing into another world and changing her appearance, the person inside remained the same. She caught her reflection in a mirror and wondered if maybe she should try smiling. Maybe then things would change. At that moment, Albert appeared behind her, calling out to her hesitantly. He asked what she was doing, staring at herself like that. Haruka instinctively built a wall between them, as always. Albert sighed, then spoke frankly. He knew she had overheard the conversation at the tavern. Haruka finally admitted she had amnesia, which was why she couldn't talk about her past. Albert was taken aback. Trying to be brave, Haruka confessed that she wasn't good at thinking about dreams or the future. She just went along with everyone else. With low self-esteem, she apologized for depending too much on them, saying it must have been unpleasant. Then, she added softly that maybe it would be better if she stayed alone from now on. Albert was shocked and pressed further. Did that mean she didn't need them anymore? Haruka quickly denied it. She was simply bad at connecting with people. Even expressing her feelings now made her anxious. She didn't want to cause trouble later on. Albert frowned, honest as always, and met her eyes. He told her he didn't see her as a burden at all. He apologized for his earlier words, but said he never thought badly of her. From his point of view, Haruka was amazing, capable, smart, and kind. But that was all he knew about her. What he really wanted was to know her better, as a friend, as a teammate. Then, feeling guilty for not realizing she had amnesia, he lowered his head. He waited for her to respond, but Haruka stayed quiet. Finally, he turned to leave. Something in her stirred. Remembering her cowardice from the past, she reached out and grabbed his shoulder. Her heart pounded with anxiety. When Albert turned in surprise, she quickly pulled her hand back and apologized. Then, gathering her courage, she said what she truly felt, that Albert was amazing too. Unlike her, who always ran from fear, he charged straight toward his goals. She found that dazzling and a little enviable. Albert blushed slightly, proud to be praised by someone stronger than him. Haruka continued, admitting that what she said earlier about being alone wasn't true. Honestly, she still wanted to stay with her 3 friends, if that was okay. Albert's face lit up. Pointing at her with mock irritation, he scolded her for not saying that earlier. He'd thought she wanted to leave their party. Then he laughed and told her that now that he'd finally reached rank 5, the 4 of them could take on an expedition together. It was his way of cheering her up, knowing she had never traveled before. With renewed energy, Albert urged her to come back to the tavern so they could tell the others. Haruka smiled faintly. After all her years of running away from fear, she had finally found the courage to take a step forward, and followed Albert to the tavern. A few days later, the expedition quest began. The team was hired as bodyguards, though they also helped load the heavy cargo onto wagons. As usual, Albert was already exhausted, struggling to lift the crates, while Corin and another man laughed at his misery. That man, a middle-aged worker in charge of cargo management and the land dragons, soon introduced himself as Cody. He chuckled when he noticed Haruka staring in awe. This was her first time seeing a land dragon. The creature looked more like a wingless lizard, shorter and sturdier than she had imagined. The quest itself had been given to them by a guild receptionist a few days earlier, an escort mission for a delegation heading to Region, a neighboring country west of Orance. The holy nation of Region was home to the Oracle faith, said to be where their deity first descended. Scholars and researchers from all over the world gathered at its grand academy, the cultural heart of the continent. Albert had been eager to accept the mission, but his companions were hesitant. It sounded too high level. The receptionist, however, assured them that since they had defeated the tyrant boar, this should be no problem. Besides, the quest came with a recommendation from the city's merchant guild. She'd even mentioned that Region's side had already hired other guards. Albert couldn't help but wonder why they were needed at all, but the receptionist only laughed, saying it was always good for travelers to meet promising adventurers for the future. Now, back to the present. The land dragon eyed Haruka curiously. Cody introduced the creature as Ojin, a friendly type that enjoyed being petted. Hesitant but intrigued, Haruka reached out and stroked its scales. The dragon's warmth and calm breathing made her heart swell. Before she knew it, she couldn't stop petting it, her eyes shining like a child's. Catching herself, she quickly stepped back, lowered her hoodie, and properly introduced herself to Cody. It was then Cody noticed. Haruka was a dark elf. He hadn't seen one in decades, not since his travels far to the south. Haruka immediately grew uneasy, wondering if her race would cause problems during the journey. Cody just smiled knowingly until Haruka finally asked what he meant. He confessed that a rumor had been spreading lately, that dark elves were creations of the god of destruction. The word stunned Haruka. It wasn't a good thing to hear, but Cody reassured her that such talk came from prejudice. He said dark elves are rare after all, and if anything happens during the trip, just tell him right away. In Orance, Haruka had never faced discrimination, but she knew other countries could be different, and she silently promised herself to stay cautious. Not long after, a group of people dressed in white cloaks and armor arrived, greeting Cody. Among them were two hooded twins standing at the back. Cody introduced his hired guards to the man leading the group, Decked, the leader of the Temple Knights. Albert shook his hand first, introducing himself with enthusiasm. Then Cody straightened up, his expression suddenly formal, and declared that he was the representative of the delegation. Albert froze, stunned. He had thought Cody was just in charge of logistics. Haruka and Montana weren't surprised. They'd read the quest details more carefully. Once introductions were done, the convoy set off toward Region. On the road, Albert couldn't stop eyeing the twin youths, and asked one of the knights about them. The knight explained they were students from Region's seminary, sent on this expedition as part of their graduation project for the Oracle Church. Haruka noted how young they looked, only 13. Both were gifted mages who had skipped several grades, though their expressions were constantly sour. Albert, being his usual energetic self, tried to chat with them, but the twins only glared, frowning in perfect sync. Albert froze mid-sentence, his confidence instantly shattered. Haruka considered talking to them too, but decided against it. She felt her spirit would break before she even began. Suddenly, Montana appeared from the bushes, holding a bunch of fruits he had gathered. He offered them to his friends, confused by Albert's gloomy face. Haruka teased him, explaining the twin disaster that had crushed Albert's energy. The twins grew visibly irritated by how noisy the group was, and Montana's sharp beastman ears picked it up right away. He turned and walked straight up to them, catching the twins off guard. One instinctively stepped back, while the other glared as if to challenge him. But Montana only handed them the fruit. The twins scolded him, warning he'd trip walking backward, but he kept offering the fruit anyway. Confused, they finally accepted it, just to make him stop. Albert nearly yelled in surprise, while Haruka just smiled knowingly. Montana always had that natural charm. Finally, the Beastman introduced himself, and the twins, seemingly defeated by his persistence, gave in and introduced themselves as Theo and Leo. No one could tell them apart. Albert was amazed. How had Montana managed to get the grumpy pair to talk? A knight nearby guessed it was because Montana looked close to their age, but in truth, he was 3 years older, a proper big brother figure. Leo pouted when Theo kept chatting with Montana and pulled him into the middle so they could walk together. From then on, the three became inseparable, talking easily as the journey continued. As the group traveled farther, Haruka looked back and saw Oran's in the distance, its skyline glowing beneath the sun. Cody's words echoed in her mind, along with the uneasy truth about her dark elf blood. Maybe, she thought, finding out why she was born this way could also be the reason she kept moving forward in this new world. On the 4th day of their journey, things had gone surprisingly smoothly. No major problems so far. Lately, Haruka had been taking the night watch more often, quiet hours when she could talk with Albert about defense strategies in case of an ambush. Albert mentioned that his father always told him, protect the mages first. His mother was a mage too, so it made sense. Haruka changed the subject, saying Korin had once told her why she wanted to become an adventurer, but it seemed even Korin herself had forgotten the reason. Haruka felt a bit awkward about asking. She sounded like some nosy adult prying into a young girl's life. Albert thought for a moment before answering. He said Korin used to be easily scared. Just hearing stories about adventurers made her tremble. But one day, she suddenly declared she would become one herself. Since then, she'd only grown stronger. Watching his childhood friend change like that, Albert admitted he never knew if Korin was inspired by his own dream to become an adventurer, but he made himself a promise to grow stronger and protect her properly. Listening to him, Haruka couldn't deny how admirable he was. He had conviction, something she herself lacked. Then, a deep, echoing wolf's howl tore through the night. Instantly, Haruka and Albert went on alert. In the tents nearby, Korin, Montana, and the other knights jolted awake. Albert rose to his feet and quickly told Haruka to wake the rest before they were surrounded. Haruka turned toward the nearest tent, the twins. She slipped inside without permission. Both were still fast asleep. She shook them awake and told them a pack of wolves was heading their way. Theo woke first, grabbing his staff, while Leo still looked a little panicked. Haruka calmly directed them outside, telling them to move the torches and stand by at the rear. Leo tried to lift a bundle of torches, but struggled under the weight. Haruka took over effortlessly, carrying 2 bundles at once. The twins stared in shock. Wasn't she supposed to be a dark elf mage? For a moment, they wondered if she was actually a martial artist. They quickly lit the torches, forming a ring of light around the camp. Korin frowned. It was strange. Wolves rarely attacked humans in groups. Cody chuckled quietly, already knowing what they were really up against. These weren't ordinary wolves. Their leader was a monster, 5 times the size of a normal forest wolf. From a distance, the sound of pounding paws grew louder, but Cody didn't flinch. He told the others he believed in them. After all, they had already taken down a tyrant boar before. That trust fired Albert up even more. He grinned wide, ready for battle. The knights drew their weapons, warning that the pack was closing in. Moments later, the wolves burst into the light, and chaos followed. Albert, Korin, Montana, and the others fought fiercely as endless waves of wolves lunged from the darkness. At the same time, the twins, Theo and Leo, supported from behind, chanting their spells. Haruka joined in, her voice steady as she cast her own incantation. At first, their spells seemed similar, but the twins used Blade of Wind, while Haruka invoked something stronger, Wind of the Moon. The twins paused mid-chant, realizing the difference. As they turned toward the dark elf, 5 shimmering wind blades formed around her, hovering in perfect control. Leo and Theo froze, stunned. How could she summon 5 blades at once, when even as top students, they could only conjure 2? From the side, 2 wolves lunged toward them. Haruka spun around instantly, commanding a wind cutter to strike. At first, the wolves kept leaping forward, as if nothing had happened. But just like with the tyrant boar, thin red lines appeared across their heads. A split second later, their bodies were cleanly sliced in 2. The cut was sharp, precise, effortless. Even in the chaos, Haruka was confused. There were too many of them, too much noise, but she forced herself to focus, attacking and defending the twin mages behind her at the same time. Leo and Theo were panicking, desperately trying to chant Blade of Wind again. But Haruka, already locked in concentration, moved faster. 5 wind blades flared around her. It was almost impossible. Both twins knew it. How much magic power did she have to summon that many? Haruka drew a slow breath, sharpening her senses. She couldn't afford to lose focus for even a second. Elsewhere, Corin fired arrow after arrow, taking down multiple wolves in a row. She didn't notice the one creeping up behind her, but Albert did. He rushed in just in time, knocking it away before it could bite her. All around, the group fought desperately as the wolves kept coming with no end in sight. Haruka quickly assessed the situation. For a first real team battle, they were doing remarkably well. She didn't notice the twins behind her glaring, not with anger exactly, but something between irritation and disbelief. When Haruka turned and asked if she'd done something wrong, the two only pouted and looked away. That slight distraction cost them. None of them noticed the danger closing in from behind. The leader of the pack had finally appeared, a monstrous wolf, far larger and more dangerous than the rest, its glowing eyes locked on the three mages. With a roar, it lunged straight at the twins. Haruka reacted on instinct, pulling both of them into her arms and rolling away, just as the beast's fangs snapped shut. From a distance, Decht realized the main monster was targeting the mages, but he and the others were too far, still surrounded by the lesser wolves. Haruka had no choice. They would have to deal with it alone. She steadied herself, stepping closer to the monster. If she could just take down the leader, this battle would end. She stretched out her arm, ready to chant. But before she could finish the spell, the massive wolf lunged again, its jaws closing around her outstretched arm. Theo and Leo screamed, frozen in shock, as the dark elf's hand disappeared between the beast's enormous fangs. Theo reacted faster than the others, urging his twin to hurry and cast something to assist Haruka. Decht rushed forward as well, ready to help, handing the remaining wolves over to Albert. But Albert only watched from afar, with a crooked smile, unfazed by the chaos. He was certain Haruka could handle the monster wolf alone. He was right. The creature froze in confusion, unable to understand why the elf's arm didn't tear or crush under its jaws, while Haruka's expression remained completely calm, unfazed by pain. Instead of struggling, she quietly muttered to herself, deciding which spell to use. She settled on Fire Arrow. With steady focus, she cast the spell through the arm still trapped in the monster's mouth, firing the attack from inside its throat. A sharp burst of light flared, and the creature exploded from within, its body scattering across the ground in an instant. With their leader gone, the remaining wolves scattered in panic, marking the party's victory. Decht hurried over, worried sick. Haruka was drenched in the wolf's blood, and the knight tried to inspect her arm, expecting a severe wound, but the dark elf simply looked at her hand in complete composure. There wasn't a single scratch. Even after rinsing the blood from her skin, nothing appeared. Relief washed over Decht, though confusion lingered, and he moved on to burn the wolf's corpse so it wouldn't rise as an undead. Albert walked over and slung an arm around Haruka, proud of her as usual. Meanwhile, Montana and Corin poked and prodded her arm, making absolutely sure she wasn't injured. Haruka herself was quietly shocked. The monster's attack had been brutal, yet she hadn't felt any pain at all. As she wiped the blood from her face, the mage twins approached hesitantly. Leo bowed in gratitude for saving them. If not for her, they might have died. Haruka responded awkwardly, unsure how to handle the praise. Leo pushed Theo to thank her too, but Theo, stubborn and prideful, only offered a reluctant gesture, before bluntly stating that her magic was creepy. Haruka froze at that. Albert and Corin laughed awkwardly behind her. Inside, the words stung. She had always expected people to see her as creepy old man after all. Her thoughts broke when Leo asked whether she had a magic teacher. She didn't. She only read a little from books and barely knew the basics. As thanks, Leo offered to teach her foundational magic, though Theo wasn't thrilled at first. Both twins were geniuses back at the academy, where magic had long since become dull for them because no one could match their level. But after witnessing Haruka's spell, they realized she stood far above them. Leo teased his twin, knowing Theo was just as curious about her magic. They both sensed there was something to learn from a dark elf who operated beyond the academy's standards. Haruka, ever doubtful of herself, asked if it wouldn't trouble them. Hearing she genuinely wanted to learn made the twins unexpectedly excited to continue. Leo started by asking about basic mana principles. Haruka managed that part. Mana could be converted into magic through the mind. As they continued walking, he asked her to cast Water Ball for their first analysis. She recited the spell, quickly forming a water sphere the size of a head. Theo asked if she could feel the flow of mana, and she answered uncertainly. Annoyed by her vague response, he scolded her. Natural types who could cast magic without understanding it were rare, and that alone was unsettling. Worse, her spells gathered far more mana than necessary. Skilled mages always used only the minimum required. To them, her magic was wildly inefficient. But Theo didn't stop there. He stepped back and told her to walk toward him. The water ball drifted after her. Normally, without specific instructions, a spell like that should stay in place. Only when he pointed it out did Haruka realize it, and the sphere burst onto the ground. Leo then explained body enhancement. It coated the user's body inside and out with mana, combining emission and enveloping magic. Doing both at once wasn't easy, but Haruka had been performing it unconsciously, simply wishing for it. The more she thought about it, the more uneasy she became. What would the others think of her if they knew how unnatural she was? But Korin suddenly wrapped her arms around Haruka from behind, laughing, because all of it simply meant Haruka was incredibly strong. Albert seemed unbothered as always, confident he would slowly surpass her someday. His optimism was almost unreal. Montana didn't say anything but touched Haruka's arm gently with his tail. None of them cared that she was an overwhelmingly powerful dark elf with limitless potential. The realization eased something inside her. Then Cody interrupted, pointing out that dawn had already broken. They decided to stop for breakfast before continuing their journey. As the sun climbed higher, Cody explained to Haruka that only one more mountain stood between them and the holy nation of Region. Before that, they planned to restock supplies, and they should soon reach a village he had visited once before. His steps slowed, and he grew strangely quiet. When they finally arrived, the sight froze everyone in place. The entire village had been slaughtered. Bodies lay scattered across the ground. Haruka, unaccustomed to such brutality, covered her mouth, fighting the nausea tightening in her chest. Albert and one of the knights checked a nearby house. The scene didn't look like the work of monsters or bandits. The homes were still intact, untouched by looting or destruction. Everyone gathered again, and judging by the state of the area, the attackers were long gone. They split up to search for any survivors. Haruka wandered alone and entered one of the houses. The moment she cracked open the door, a thick, rotten stench rushed out. She coughed sharply and froze at the sight of a mother and child lying lifeless on the bed. Her heart ached at the thought of a peaceful village meeting such a cruel end. Cody was already waiting outside, having noticed how pale she had gone. He suggested she wait beyond the village if it became too much, but Haruka refused, unwilling to leave this tragedy for her companions to shoulder without her. Cody nodded, understanding her resolve. They continued checking the houses together. Cody recognized one of the fallen villagers, a man who had warmly welcomed his group during his last visit and had invited them to come again. The memory left a hollow heaviness in Haruka's chest. Cody's expression softened with grief. Life, he thought, was fragile, but that didn't mean it deserved to be crushed so mercilessly. In another house, Montana's fox-like ears twitched. A large wooden wardrobe stood against the wall. Montana forced it open, and both of them froze in shock. Beneath a pile of fabric lay a baby boy. The baby rested quietly in Haruka's arms. Cody examined him, noting how strangely calm he was for a child, surrounded by strangers. His blanket had the name Yuri embroidered on it. It was likely his name. Cody studied him more carefully. He had never seen the boy before, and the baby's jet black hair and eyes were extremely rare. The thought formed easily that the massacre may have happened because of this child. Then, as if responding to that grim suspicion, the baby began to cry. Before the idea could settle further, Dek called for Cody. They decided to take the child back to the standby group while Cody and Dek did a brief patrol. Cody refused to leave the mysterious baby in a place filled with corpses and entrusted the temporary safety of the area to Albert and the others. Haruka looked at Yuri one more time. Something about a baby surviving this catastrophe felt unnatural, but at the very least, one life had been spared. Meanwhile, the truth behind Yuri's survival was far more tragic. On the night of the attack, his mother and her younger sister were overwhelmed with panic as intruders stormed their residence. Yuri's mother urged her sister to take the child and flee, insisting she would hold the attackers back. Yuri's mother already knew this day would come the moment the emperor chose Yuri as his heir. She was only a concubine, a commoner, while the princes and nobles would never accept it quietly. Her sister snapped of the memory, seeing Yuri's mother dragged away to the emperor's palace to bear his child. It was for that very reason she refused to let her sister die in vain. But Yuri's mother cupped her sister's cheeks gently, thanking her for her kindness and loyalty. She begged her to protect Yuri, not for the empire's sake, but for her own. In the end, her sister obeyed, fleeing with the baby and hiding in a remote border village. Yet guilt gnawed at her. Bringing innocent villagers into this chaos was something she would regret forever. At the small inn, she opened a wooden wardrobe and placed Yuri inside with the utmost tenderness. She smiled down at him one last time. Then, gathering every last shred of courage, she ran toward the cliffs with an empty baby basket in her arms. Right at the edge, she hurled the basket into the ravine and collapsed in tears, pretending it had slipped from her grasp. When the emperor's soldiers found her, she didn't stop acting, insisting that the baby had fallen. She knew her life would be taken within moments, but fear no longer held her. With a faint smile, she prayed that Yuri would live happily, for herself and for her sister. Not long after, Cody and Decht discovered her body. They doubted she was Yuri's mother. Her features didn't resemble those of anyone from the southern continent. Her body had been torn apart by beasts, yet the signs of brutal torture were unmistakable. Dektik couldn't hide his admiration for Cody's sharp analysis, made solely from the corpse's condition. Cody looked down at the woman's remains with quiet sorrow. From the state of her body, he knew Yuri had been protected with every ounce of her strength, and because of that, it was now their turn to continue protecting him. They offered a brief prayer for her soul to rest in peace before moving on. The group eventually continued their journey. Along the way, Yuri didn't fuss at all. One of the knights assumed the baby must be incredibly smart, maybe even able to understand what they were saying. Haruka found herself thinking the same thing. Maybe Yuri was just like her, someone from another world, or maybe he was simply an unusually bright baby. Whatever the truth was, they still had to protect him. As darkness settled in, Leo lit a lantern using his magic, ignition. It was Haruka's first time seeing that kind of method. Leo casually explained that it was only a simple spell. Albert took the lantern and walked a little ahead of Haruka to make sure she didn't trip while carrying Yuri. Behind them, Corin noticed Theo sulking and called him out. She told him to stop being so stubborn. She could tell just from his expression what he was feeling. With a sigh, she added that no one ever knew what the future might bring, so it would be better if Theo learned to be honest with himself. Slowly, the boy approached Haruka. Shy and unsure, he looked at Yuri with sympathy. Saddened by the thought of a child so young having to survive alone, he quietly wondered what he could do for him. Haruka offered a gentle smile, saying they could think about it together as they moved forward. Albert shrugged in amusement, realizing Theo might be a decent kid after all. Leo, already well aware of his twin's softer side, simply agreed. After a long night of traveling, they finally reached their destination. Haruka and the others brightened the moment they saw the sight before them, a sprawling city, and towering in the distance, a grand castle, the holy nation of Legion. Theo explained that they had technically entered Legion the moment they crossed the mountains, but this place was just a frontier town. The castle ahead was their true destination, the religious capital, Vista, a magnificent white fortress known as the headquarters of the Oracle Faith. Another knight chimed in, describing Vista as a breathtaking city, expanding outward with layers of walls stacked one after another. Each district had its own character. By leaving defense management to the kingdom's descent, the nation could station their knights across the land, keeping peace tight. That was why people gathered there. Academics, culture, and so much more thrived within its walls. Cody then offered to take Yuri and escort Haruka's group ahead to Vista, saying it would be better than lingering here. The other knights would stay behind to transport the supplies. The twins would go with them as part of their graduation assignment. They parted ways there, promising to meet again later. Haruka and the others rode with Cody in a horse-drawn carriage, amazed by how different the buildings were from their homeland. Cody explained that their contract would end once they reached Vista, and they would be free to go. But now there was a baby to consider, and if they had spare time, he hoped the rookie adventurers would stay a bit longer. He assured them that he would cover their lodging and pay for any extra time if needed, offering the option with a warm smile. Of course, Haruka and the others agreed. It felt a little too convenient, but there was no reason to refuse. They arrived at a large mansion with spacious grounds and tall leafy trees shading the sides. It was Cody's home. He planned to take Yuri inside, but wanted to explain everything to his wife first, asking the others to wait outside. Yuri turned toward Haruka, and the elf noticed it. The baby gently curled her tiny fingers around Haruka's hand, and Haruka reassured him with a soft smile, promising they would meet again. Haruka looked at the grand house, then at Cody and his wife, radiant and content. Compared to her own past, living alone, broke, and isolated, they felt like people from an entirely different world. Once everything regarding Yuri was settled, the group was led to another mansion, just as luxurious as Cody's, perhaps too luxurious. Albert and the others were stunned when Cody told them this would be their lodging. They immediately refused to rest in a place like that, but Cody burst out laughing, saying he was only joking. He ushered the adventurers back into the carriage, and strangely enough, they circled back the way they came. Cody smiled proudly, insisting that one must stay true to themselves and keep a playful spirit to stay young. The others responded with awkward chuckles. It seemed Cody just wanted to show off. Eventually, they stopped at another mansion, this one simpler, built of stone walls like a refined inn. Albert and the others looked at it with satisfaction. It was only 5 minutes from the Adventurers Guild, and they agreed to rest there. Soon after, Cody excused himself. He had matters to attend to, but if anything happened concerning Yuri, he would contact them immediately. After Cody left, Albert invited the group to head to the guild and check the quest board. On the way, they crossed paths with a group of young girls. One of them froze, slowly turned toward Haruka with a horrified expression, and pointed at her rudely, before screaming in panic about a dark elf. Haruka was startled, but she followed her friends straight to the guild after Korin called for them. Cody's words about the origins of the dark elves echoed in her mind, yet she hadn't expected such open hostility. She sighed, thinking at least the girls from earlier weren't trying to pick a fight. But she was wrong. The girl who had called out to her, a dark elf, turned toward them with a weary expression, and Haruka sensed trouble was about to begin. Wanting to keep things peaceful, Haruka approached the girl and asked if she needed help. Before she could say more, Albert placed a firm hand on her shoulder. His eyes sharpened as he glared at the girl who had stopped them, and he told Haruka to stay out of it. Korin and Montana also suggested they ignore the commotion and focus on the quest board, but the stranger who named Sarah refused to back down. She pointed straight at Haruka and ordered the dark elf girl beside her to fight her. Even though the girl looked terrified, she demanded that if she won, Haruka must release the people she had brainwashed. Hearing such a baseless accusation sent Albert into an instant rage. He snapped at Sarah, saying she could fight him first before challenging Haruka out of nowhere. But Sarah's friends rushed to support her, insisting she was a divine child who couldn't possibly lose to an ordinary adventurer. Haruka quickly realized Sarah was deeply afraid, probably even younger than the twin mage. Meanwhile, Albert held nothing back. He didn't care who they were. He'd defend Haruka and had no problem beating these girls until they couldn't walk. With a weary sigh, Haruka said she would handle it herself and agreed to Sarah's demands. They all headed to the guild's training grounds. Haruka asked for the rules, while Korin and Montana relaxed, snacking without a hint of worry. From the sidelines, Albert yelled reminders to Haruka not to accidentally kill anyone and told the dark elf girl to take it easy. Haruka forced a smile in response. Hearing that only made Sarah panic, and she hurriedly requested a no-killing rule. Haruka proposed a simple condition: whoever sustained a major injury would lose. The dark elf then asked what she would get if she won. Sarah, reluctant but determined, declared she would become Haruka's servant, even though the offer held no real benefit. Haruka gave a faint smile and told the group of girls to come at her with everything they had. Sarah led them, raising her staff as they all prepared to cast in unison. The dark elf recognized the spell instantly, Wind Cutter, and froze. That spell was dangerous, potentially lethal. Did these kids not understand what would happen if magic like that hit someone? Haruka let out a heavy breath. As an adult, it was her responsibility to set the law and teach them right from wrong. She strode quickly toward the girls before they could finish the incantation. The closer she came, the more panicked they grew, until several turned and fled in fear. Haruka stopped in front of Sarah, who stood frozen with her staff raised, unsure what to do. With swift movements, Haruka scooped up the two younger girls beside Sarah and carried them off the field, setting them down safely before returning. Sarah had already completed her Wind Cutter spell, the blade of wind suspended in the air, but she still hadn't released it. Haruka sprinted toward her, and in her panic, Sarah reflexively fired the spell straight at her. Sarah froze when she saw Haruka make no effort to dodge. Instead of retreating, Haruka sprinted straight toward the incoming spell, unflinching. Panic surged through Sarah. She tried desperately to cancel the magic before it hit, to break it apart in midair, but she was too late. The wind cutter struck Haruka's arm, erupting with a sharp blast. When the dust cleared, her arm was perfectly intact, clean, uninjured, untouched. Haruka looked down at Sarah, who had collapsed to the ground in shock, and sharply asked if she was ready to surrender. Sarah burst into tears, overwhelmed by guilt and fear, and choked out her surrender. Haruka exhaled in relief. She gathered the shaken children and delivered a stern lecture. They shouldn't pick fights with people whose intentions they couldn't read. If Haruka had been a villain, they could all have died. And Windcutter was a lethal spell. Using magic like that so carelessly on others was completely unacceptable. Once she dismissed them, the group scattered, though Sarah lingered behind, head lowered as if she had something to say. Timidly, she asked Haruka whether dark elves were apostles of the god of destruction. According to her teacher, the oracle looked like a regular elf, while the god Zest appeared like a dark elf. Haruka had no idea how to answer. To her, it was just a rumor. And besides, the god living inside her was nothing more than an old man. In the end, she simply introduced herself properly. She stated her name, then introduced her friends, and made it clear she was only an adventurer. No grand mission, no desire to harm anyone. Whether Sarah believed her or not was another matter entirely. Sarah looked both guilty and amazed. Even after casting such a dangerous spell, Haruka hadn't been hurt at all. With renewed determination, she declared that she would keep her promise and, starting from that day onward, dedicate herself as Haruka's servant. Haruka could only give a weary, bitter smile. Why was this happening to her again? Behind her, Korin laughed until he nearly doubled over. The next morning, Sarah invited Haruka and the others to have breakfast together. She was cheerful and proud, saying that as Haruka's servant, she could prepare something delicious for everyone. After that, she properly introduced herself. She was only 13, currently attending the Legion Theological Academy. Both her parents were priests of the Oracle faith, and she was expected to become one too. She was also known as a Dreamseer Prophetess, a title that immediately confused Albert and the rest. Sarah explained that it meant she was a child beloved by the gods, gifted with special abilities, combat, magic, or something unique that ordinary people didn't have. Albert quickly pieced it together. Sarah's ability had to be prophetic dreams. She nodded. She could see fragments of her own future in her sleep, though she had no control over them, which made the ability feel useless to her. She lowered her head for a moment, then glanced at Haruka with uncertainty. One of her dreams had shown Haruka clearly. In that dream, Haruka was attacking her. The vision shocked the dark elf, and it finally explained why Sarah had been so panicked and terrified before. Albert found the whole thing strange. Haruka would never attack someone like Sarah, and Sarah herself felt the same. The more she thought about it, the more she realized something was off. In the dream, her vantage point was much higher, and she had been holding a staff. Haruka fell silent. It meant that someday she might end up opposing the Oracle faith, even though she didn't want to fight anyone if she could help it. Maybe there was something in her future she wouldn't be able to avoid. To lift the heavy mood, Sarah reminded her that the dream hadn't happened yet, and not every dream ever came true. Cody arrived then, greeting everyone. His eyes went straight to Sarah. He recognized her instantly, already knowing she was the Dreamseer Prophetess, and asked what brought her there. Albert briefly summarized yesterday's incident, while Cody pulled up a chair to join them. The man nodded, as if everything matched what he had already suspected. The rumors really had spread quickly. After a sigh, Cody lowered his head and apologized to Haruka. In Vista, any human who hadn't committed a crime was supposed to live comfortably under the protection of the Oracle faith. The only reason yesterday ended peacefully was because Haruka was kind. With someone else, the result could have been far worse. Sarah only grew more guilty hearing that. Cody's expression then shifted into something serious, but faintly playful. He formally requested Haruka's help. If they ever came across another kid like Sarah causing trouble, he wanted Haruka to rough them up a little. Everyone froze, unsure how to react, especially Haruka. Cody clarified that he wanted the Dark Elf to provide educational guidance to any disrespectful youngster they encountered. Albert and Korin didn't mind the idea, but Haruka hesitated. She said she could accept the request, but she preferred avoiding violence and trying to talk things out first. For some reason, Cody went quiet at that. Sarah suddenly stood up, saying she would help spread the word that Haruka wasn't dangerous. People probably wouldn't believe her, but at least she would try. With that, the request became official, and Cody said he was counting on Haruka and her friends again. Albert then suggested they explore the town together, and they decided to wander around for the day. Before they left, Cody called Haruka aside to give her a piece of advice. With a tap on her shoulder, he told her that her peaceful way of solving problems was admirable, but it was a philosophy for the strong, a belief that she would be fine no matter how others treated her. He said it as someone who had once been on the weaker side, and he wanted her to remember it. His words lingered in Haruka's mind for a long time. Then she rejoined the others, and with Sarah acting as their guide, they spent the next few hours exploring the town. That night at the inn, Haruka found herself thinking again about Cody's words. Maybe she was being a little full of herself. The more she reflected on it, the more naive her ideals sounded. Sarah and her friends had used magic on her, magic strong enough to kill an ordinary person. That hadn't been a childish prank. In their own way, they were trying to protect everyone from danger. And yet, when her own life was threatened, all she did was lecture them. The imbalance made her feel more and more like an overly soft, naive adult. Korin called out to her from the neighboring bed, asking if she couldn't sleep because of Sarah's prophetic dream. The girl wrapped her arms around Haruka, knowing how sensitive she could be sometimes, and even offered to sleep beside her. Haruka immediately refused. Korin eventually went back to sleep, telling her to rest soon, and that small bit of kindness eased something inside Haruka's chest. The next day, they wandered around town again. Montana and Albert noticed a small child trailing them ever since they left the inn. Albert was certain he was similar to Sarah when they first met. Realizing he had been spotted, the boy tried to flee, and Albert eagerly sprinted after him. Since he was tiny, Albert easily caught him by the back of his collar. Haruka approached the frightened boy, lowered his hood, and revealed her dark elf ears. To her surprise, the boy only grew flustered and wide-eyed, mesmerized by finally seeing something so ethereal up close. Haruka crouched down and asked if she could talk with him for a moment. Shockingly, the boy agreed, shy but obedient. Over the next few days, she spent time speaking with several children around town. She told them it was fine to be wary of dark elves, but she wanted them to see her kind with their own eyes, think for themselves, and then decide how to treat her. At the very least, she had no intention of harming anyone. Slowly, the children's fear loosened, and they began talking openly with her, their faces brightening as they listened to her stories as an adventurer. They eventually crossed paths again with the genius mage siblings. Leo praised how well Haruka handled the situation. She laughed softly. The kids were genuinely curious and full of questions about magic, about her travels. Clearly those children are eager to learn. Haruka smiled at the thought. Then it made her think all of the misunderstanding of Dark Elf probably started from the Academy teacher stories. Sarah even mentioned it before. Theo rolled his eyes at a woman behind them, then dragged her toward Haruka, pointing out that the Dark Elf must want to meet an Academy teacher. They had brought their aunt, a history instructor at the Legion Theological Academy. The woman lowered her hood, revealing soft blonde braids. Her name was Martina, and she looked at Haruka with a nervous expression. Haruka watched Martina for a long moment. So this woman was the root cause of the entire Dark Elf mess. Theo had already handed things over to Leo, choosing instead to wander off with Albert and Korin. Martina then suggested the three of them talk somewhere quieter. Before long, they moved to a place that looked like a warm, cozy library. Haruka stared in awe at the towering shelves, the sheer number of books, and the groups of people quietly discussing things over cups of tea. Martina guided them to a comfortable corner and even ordered hot drinks for everyone. The atmosphere was slightly awkward. Martina clearly didn't know how to begin. Leo nudged his aunt, urging her to introduce herself. Flustered and nervous, she finally gave her full name and her position as the history teacher at the academy. Suddenly, Martina stood up and bowed deeply, apologizing. Because of her teaching methods, Haruka had ended up facing trouble during her time in Vista. Haruka felt a little uncomfortable seeing that. but she accepted the apology and also asked for an explanation on how the dark elf rumors even started. While scooping cake onto his fork, Leo listened as Martina said she never intended to portray dark elves as evil. With a regretful sigh, she admitted she only wanted her students to take an interest in world history. But as a new teacher, she'd gotten overly passionate and failed to explain things clearly. Hearing that made Haruka curious. She wanted to know more about dark elf history too. Seeing her interest awakened Martina's instincts as a teacher, and with renewed energy, she offered to explain everything from the very beginning, starting with the twin goddesses. The two gods, Oracle and Zest, envisioned the world. They created the land, the animals, and fashioned elves and dark elves in their own image. Oracle, who valued creation, compassion, and the meaning of things that eventually break, created humans, a people gifted in crafting and nurturing. Zest, who believed living beings should be brave and fierce, created aggressive creatures known as destroyers. Even though the gods themselves held no desire to fight, conflict between those who inherited their wills became inevitable. The war of gods and humans dragged on for ages, and countless things were lost. Only a few survived to rebuild, leading to the world as it exists now. In the end, Martina said passionately that both destroyers and humans, though different, were equally beloved by the gods. Leo had to calm her down before she made a scene. He pointed out that she always went off topic in class and really should just return to the Academy's research lab, especially since she also had personal feelings when it came to dark elves. Haruka felt intrigued. She hadn't seen any other dark elves around. Was something going on? Leo shot Martina a knowing look, as if she'd caused trouble before. With a weary sigh, Martina admitted that when she'd still been in the research lab, she had a fiancé. Wanting to study dark elves up close, he traveled to the southern continent 4 years ago and still hadn't returned. Haruka wondered if he might have died or run into danger, but Martina quickly cut in. She still received letters from him. The problem was the content. All he ever did was praise the physical beauty of dark elves, endlessly. Naturally, Martina had been consumed by jealousy. She couldn't help herself and had gotten far too worked up. Leo even had to hold her back. At last, Martina calmed down again and sat back down, apologizing to Haruka once more. She never meant to insult all dark elves. Haruka studied Martina carefully. She could tell the woman in front of her was serious and genuinely passionate about what she loved. It was obvious Martina had never meant any harm, but Leo scolded her again, pointing out that she taught far too many things that strayed from the Oracle Faith's doctrines. Sooner or later, it was bound to cause her trouble. Haruka asked whether the mythology taught by the Oracle Faith was actually different. Leo confirmed it, and to prevent the dark elf from misunderstanding, he offered to teach her his version as well. In the creation myth he'd learned, the twin goddesses had fallen out. They clashed on the southern continent using their own creations. Oracle hadn't wanted conflict, but under Zest's fierce, relentless assault, she had no choice but to teach humans how to fight. Magic itself was born during that age. Haruka listened closely. The biggest difference was how the Oracle Faith portrayed Zest as the villain, leading dark elves to be viewed as inherently dangerous. Intrigued, Haruka asked to hear the full story. She found the differing histories fascinating, which made Martina visibly relieved and even more enthusiastic. Leo suggested they continue their talk outside, since Martina might lose control of her excitement in the quiet library. His aunt laughed and agreed, proposing they walk and chat instead. They strolled through the city, while Martina explained that before the Great Conflict, during the Age of Gods and Men, there were once places where destroyer and human towns stood side by side. Records even suggested the two races lived together. Imagining that in the present day felt almost impossible. After all, how could destroyers and humans ever share a peaceful city now? After a long conversation, Martina remembered she had other matters to attend to. She was delighted by the discussion, though, and shyly asked if they could talk again sometime. She would love to hear about Haruka's adventures in the future. The dark elf gave her a gentle smile, promising she would be glad to meet her again. With that, Martina bid them farewell, leaving Haruka alone with Leo. The two of them decided to head to a restaurant for dinner. At one of the places, they spotted Cody and Montana eating together. Cody immediately greeted Haruka warmly. He explained he had run into Montana and decided to join him for a meal and a chat. Haruka mentioned she had just come from speaking with Martina. Cody recognized the academy teacher at once and grew curious about what Martina had told her. Haruka sensed Cody held an important position in the Oracle faith. It felt wrong to reveal what they had learned that day, so she urged Leo to pick a different restaurant, claiming the place looked crowded. Cody, however, offered to bring over an extra chair if needed. Haruka hesitated, trying to decline. Cody glanced at her with a light chuckle, noting how reluctant the dark elf seemed to talk about her conversation with Martina. With a mild, probing smile, he asked if something difficult to discuss had come up between them. Haruka finally agreed, though a bit reluctantly, to sit with them. She explained that she only enjoyed learning about history and different races, and that she liked listening to people talk. The man simply muttered while cracking open their snack nuts. Haruka suspected that Cody wasn't a bad person, but she was certain he was looking for something. Before she ended up saying too much, she changed the topic and asked what would happen to Yuri next. Cody revealed his plan to place Yuri in an orphanage for the time being. The word temporary pulled at Haruka's curiosity. Why only for now? Was there something he wasn't saying? Cody eventually admitted that he had a slight lead regarding Yuri's identity, but since he wasn't fully sure, he didn't want to discuss it yet. Without any warning, Cody told Leo to head back first and leave the three of them alone. Leo clearly wanted to protest, but the firm, smiling look Cody gave him made it impossible to argue. With a resigned sigh, Leo stood, knowing that begging to stay would be pointless, and left after saying his goodbyes to Haruka. From Cody's demeanor toward Montana, it became obvious he wanted to speak privately with Haruka from the beginning. Haruka also felt certain he already knew what Martina had told her, so she requested that anything he wanted to discuss should be something Montana could hear as well. Cody didn't seem to mind and went straight to the point. He wanted to know what the Dark Elf thought about Martina's story, about the relationship between destroyers and humans. Before giving her thoughts, Haruka clarified that she had been properly taught the Oracle Church's doctrines too, so there was no reason to suspect Martina of straying into anything strange. Cody only laughed, unbothered by such a trivial detail, and urged Haruka to relax. After a slow, steady breath, Haruka admitted that if Martina's story was true, and if destroyers and humans really could communicate, then it was entirely possible they once lived together peacefully. Cody's expression shifted, growing just slightly more serious. He asked whether Haruka believed something like that could be possible even now. She answered honestly. She had never met a destroyer, so she had no way to know. Besides, she didn't understand why he was even asking. The man in front of her stared into her eyes for a long moment, smiling faintly in a way that left her confused. Then he leaned forward, lowered his voice, and pressed a fingertip to his lips, warning her that he was about to share a secret. He told her that he believed the newest archaeological findings were closer to the real truth than what the Oracle Church taught. Haruka raised a brow, both curious and intrigued. Cody leaned back, chuckling that he couldn't say such things openly right now. While ordering food, he added that this was the reason he quietly tried to suppress strange rumors before they spread too far. Haruka concluded that he was simply protecting his theories from being crushed. If that was the case, she wondered why he would share any of this with them. Cody confessed that he had two reasons. First, he trusted Haruka. Second, he was betting on her potential. He liked forming alliances with young, flexible-minded adventurers like her. It was a big gamble, but even if Haruka eventually betrayed him, she was still an outsider, someone the authorities could handle easily. In short, he was placing his hopes on her growth. Haruka and Montana exchanged annoyed looks. It meant Cody had been secretly testing them all along. Cody gave an awkward laugh, apologized, and promised he wouldn't do it again. Pouring water from a pitcher, Cody explained that he had plenty of connections and could find work for them. There was also the matter of Yuri. He handed the glass to Haruka with a thin smile, leaving her uncertain about what he meant. With no hesitation, he made it clear that forming an alliance with him wouldn't be a bad deal for them either. Haruka stared at the glass, then glanced at Montana, quietly asking for his opinion. The beastman only said he would leave the decision to her. After a few seconds of thought, Haruka took the glass, perhaps a little hesitantly, and drank it in one go. She stated firmly that as long as it wouldn't bring trouble to her companions, she would agree. Cody smiled, relieved by her decisiveness. The two shook hands, marking the beginning of their alliance. Haruka saw no real reason to refuse the offer. They weren't permanent residents here, so if anything happened, the risk of being dragged into trouble would be minimal, and she couldn't deny that partnering with Cody came with its own benefits. Right after their handshake, the man in front of her made a request, utterly shameless about asking so soon. He explained that during Haruka and her companions' travels, if they encountered any destroyers who seemed capable of communication, he wanted them to report it to him, and if possible, introduce them to him as well. Haruka understood his intentions instantly. Cody only laughed, not even trying to deny it. In the end, the more allies he had, the better. Even more so if there was a chance of forming a future alliance with the destroyers. She sighed, having expected something like this from a man like Cody, and warned him not to expect too much from her. The three of them continued their dinner in peace, and although everything had played out exactly as Cody intended, Haruka found that she didn't feel bad about it at all. Remembering how she once lived lonely and isolated, she felt that now she needed to stay connected with others. She made up her mind to learn how to live like a real human being, earnestly and without regret. The next morning, Albert spread out a map to discuss possible routes for their journey home. There were three options: retrace their previous path, cut through the Descent Kingdom, or pass through the Dorthard Duchy. Albert was practically buzzing with excitement about the third route, having heard rumors of a martial arts festival being held there. He didn't realize that a stranger behind them was listening in. Haruka asked where the festival would be held. Montana immediately answered that it took place in the capital city of Schubert, and added that if they left now, they could probably still make it in time to see it. Even though he seemed to support Albert's enthusiasm, something about his expression felt off, like he was holding back a discomfort he didn't want to mention. Haruka noticed instantly and watched him for a long moment. If she remembered correctly, Montana originally came from the Dorthard Duchy. Was there something unpleasant waiting for him there? Meanwhile, the Beastman kept his eyes on the map Albert had spread out, wearing an expression Haruka couldn't decipher. Montana drifted into a quiet daydream, his thoughts slipping back to the past, back to the years he spent growing up in that city. When he was younger, a boy once asked him why he was a beastman when his parents were dwarves. Before Montana could answer, an adult scolded the boy, explaining that Montana was adopted. His dwarf friend tried to comfort him, asking if he was okay, but that was the moment Montana first learned the truth. His father was a reserved man, while his mother was bright and cheerful, and although the revelation shocked him, he never questioned his love for them. Blood-related or not, he adored his dwarf parents more than anything. Montana spent most of his days at the blacksmith workshop, watching his father hammer glowing blades and armor into shape. The Dorthard Duchy bordered the hostile Grossa Empire to the south, and because of the constant threat of war, the nation prioritized military strength. In a land that revered warriors, blacksmiths flourished, and among them, Montana's father was one of the very best. Montana took immense pride in him, absorbing the rhythmic clash of steel echoing through the workshop. Customers frequently visited, often adventurers with dented armor, damage from battles with dragons or other ferocious monsters. Montana would quietly examine the broken pieces while listening, wide-eyed to their adventure stories. He admired them deeply, but as the son of a blacksmith, he always assumed he would follow in his father's footsteps. Montana was talented as well. His father checked every piece he crafted with careful eyes, praising how quickly he learned despite being a beastman. Sometimes the dwarf even admitted that he struggled to keep up with Montana's energy before patting his head with genuine affection. Yet no one else knew about Montana's skill. The other dwarves believed the master favored his adopted son too much, neglecting his longtime students. Eventually, their resentment boiled over. They confronted Montana's father, furious that someone like Montana received more attention while they were ignored. They insisted that no matter how long he trained, a beastman could never forge anything worthwhile. Montana's father defended him fiercely, claiming they wouldn't dare speak that way if they knew what Montana was capable of. He had never allowed his son's creations to be shown publicly. They were too extraordinary to sell. But Montana tugged at his father's sleeve, silently pleading. He didn't want to be shielded or forced into proving anything. The dwarves rejected the idea, arguing that they were nothing like him and insisting that a beastman could never surpass a dwarf. Then, one of Montana's closest friends stepped forward, unexpectedly proposing a contest. If they lost, they would never complain again. Fire burned in his eyes, ready to fight for Montana. But the beastman fell silent, looking at his friend, then the others. His chest ached. They had always treated him like family, day after day, and now they stood divided. So Montana whispered the only thing he could bear to say. He refused to fight, and he would quit blacksmithing from that day on. After that day, Montana became afraid to face them. He started avoiding everyone in the workshop. During his time alone, he discovered gemstones and fell in love with their shimmering light. At first, it was only something to pass the time, but after a year, then two, he became skilled enough to craft elegant accessories. When Montana reached adulthood, he made a ring for both his mother and father, and prepared a box of jewelry to be delivered to everyone at the workshop. After gathering his courage, he announced his decision to leave and become an adventurer. The sudden declaration stunned his dwarf parents, but Montana's expression showed how serious he was. Nothing could change his mind. His father, after a quiet sigh, accepted his decision with respect and full support. The old dwarf looked at his adopted son with deep affection before letting him go, reminding him that whenever the world felt too heavy, he could always come home. Montana set off. At the border, a voice called out to him. It was the friend who once challenged the others on Montana's behalf, demanding to know if he intended to leave without even saying goodbye. He ran to Montana with a determined face and confessed that he had always known Montana was far more talented than him. That challenge years ago had been a deliberate attempt to lose, hoping the others would finally shut their mouths and recognize Montana's ability. He ruffled Montana's head gently, like an older brother, but the gesture turned rough as frustration mixed in, upset that Montana planned to disappear without letting him explain. He thanked Montana, admitting that watching his talent inspired him to work harder and become a better blacksmith. He apologized for making things difficult and for running away from the chance to make things right. He wished sincerely for Montana to become a great adventurer. Unaccustomed to affection like that, Montana pushed him away and looked aside, sounding a little sharper than intended as he told the dwarf he didn't need to say all that. As he walked off, Montana promised that once he became famous, he would return and ask him to forge a weapon, so the dwarf would have to keep improving his skills. The short farewell turned unexpectedly warm, and the dwarf laughed as he watched Montana leave, sending him off with a light heart and hopeful prayers. Receiving support from the parents he adored and the friend he cherished, leaving the city where he grew up was painfully bittersweet. He couldn't help crying for a long while on the road. Stepping out of his comfort zone to chase a dream was far from easy. Montana snapped out of his memory when Haruka called his name repeatedly. Turning around, the dark elf's face looked genuinely worried. She said that if he didn't want to go to Dorthad, he could just say so. Albert and Corin grew curious, wondering what was going on. Montana simply shook his head, saying he was fine. He had only been thinking about someone he might meet there. At that moment, a stranger who had been listening in on their travel plans spoke up. He was a flamboyant-looking man with long silky blonde hair, dressed like a noble, radiating elegance and perhaps a bit too much confidence. He stepped forward to make a request of the rookie adventurers. The flamboyant man finally introduced himself as Geets Huber, the eldest son of House Huber, a baronial family from the Dothard Duchy. With extravagant pride, he flaunted his talent, boasting that he had just graduated from the prestigious Oracle Academy. Before beginning his new life, however, his father demanded that he participate in the upcoming martial arts festival to meet his fiancée. For that, he needed an escort. Conveniently enough, he had overheard Haruka and the others talking earlier, and it felt like fate had already aligned their paths. The adventurers exchanged uncertain looks. Geets' strange behavior was a serious turnoff, and they hesitated, whispering among themselves. He definitely gave off a slightly shady vibe, but at least they were headed in the same direction. Haruka asked how much time they had before the deadline. 20 days, Geets said. Plenty of time, so that part wasn't a problem. To be sure, Haruka pressed further, asking whether Geets had any experience traveling. The nobleman answered smoothly. Of course he was perfectly capable of camping and journeying like anyone else. Narrowing her eyes, Haruka pushed again, questioning his combat skills. Geets began to falter, claiming that his family was known as a martial house, so naturally he was skilled. Before she could probe deeper, he warned her that such questioning was considered rude toward nobility. Haruka shifted her approach, pointing out that if that was the case, he should hurry and prepare a formal contract. The nobleman stiffened, suddenly nervous, and awkwardly asked if a contract was truly necessary. The suspicious answer made Haruka and Korin instantly break into cold stare. The Dark Eld said sternly, if he was hiding something, they wouldn't touch the job. Panicked, Geats promised he would prepare the contract properly and insisted he had no harmful intentions. Flustered, he rushed away to draft the documents and asked them to wait. Haruka's friends praised her composure. Strict, impressive, and fearless in negotiation. She felt embarrassed by the attention. To her, it came naturally. The common sense of an adult who had worked in a previous life. To divert the conversation, she pointed out how suspicious Geats seemed, especially since a noble traveling alone without any attendants was unheard of. Montana added that House Huber really did exist in Dothard and was quite well known. Instead of speculating, Albert suggested they simply ask Geats directly once he returned, watching him struggle in the distance with his writing. He soon came back, holding the freshly written contract with trembling hands, and offered it to Haruka. She examined it closely. One clause immediately stood out. They must not speak a word to anyone about escorting Geats. If questioned, they were to say they just happened to travel together. It was bizarre. Geats swore the contract would never bring harm to them, but Haruka cut him off. He must have known who they were from the start. Just admit it. He had suddenly offered them a job without ever seeing them fight. The pay aligned suspiciously perfectly with their rank. No matter how they looked at it, nothing about this situation felt natural at all. Geats wiped the cold sweat from his forehead, admitting that Haruka's suspicion was reasonable. They were strangers meeting for the first time after all. He explained that he had taken the request based on a referral, though the person who gave it asked to remain anonymous. The answer irritated Haruka. She stared him down, expression sharp and unreadable, studying him with intense scrutiny. The nobleman visibly shrank beneath her gaze, tension tightening in his shoulders. But he held firm to his promise. He would not reveal the source of the referral. Haruka exhaled, already guessing it must have been Cody. Who else could it be? Eventually, she stated that they would accept the escort job. Geats' face burst into relief, releasing a long breath as the weight lifted from him. He thanked Haruka repeatedly, telling them they would plan the route tomorrow and meet again in the same place at the same time. Then, with the same dramatic energy he had when they first met, he bid them farewell and hurried off. Even though he was suspicious, Haruka and the others could tell he truly wasn't a bad person. The next day, they gathered again, finalized the travel route, and restocked their supplies. Before leaving Vista, they decided to hold a farewell party. Many adventurers from the guild joined. The room filled with laughter, lively chatter, and food. Korin had to keep reminding Montana not to drink too much, or he'd pass out completely. Cody was also there, sitting beside Haruka. Without hesitation, the Dark Elf confronted him. Geats' request must have been Cody's referral. Cody only laughed, already knowing Geats would spill, or, at the very least, make it obvious. From behind, Leo appeared and greeted Haruka, wanting to talk. He scowled at Cody, who understood perfectly. This was payback for shooing Leo away last time. Leo took Cody's seat, grabbed a drink, clearly wanting to discuss something important. But the adventurers behind them suddenly burst into loud singing, drowning everything out. Haruka suggested they move outside, and they stepped onto the balcony. Leo spoke first. He had been thinking about the future, about who he would become and what goals he should pursue. He had vaguely imagined becoming a teacher someday, since his magic would naturally improve as he grew. Haruka supported the idea. His explanations of magic were always incredibly clear. Encouraged, the boy flushed slightly, both embarrassed and pleased. But then he sighed, lifted his eyes to the brilliant sky, and said his thoughts had changed. Haruka followed his gaze. Above them stretched a breathtaking sky, filled with thousands of gleaming stars. Leo continued, saying he wanted to study more at the academy and then venture out into the world. He realized that if he stayed in his comfort zone, he would never wield magic as terrifying as Haruka's. He smiled at the Dark Elf. Haruka understood the word terrifying was meant as praise, and knowing the twins' awkward tsundere nature, she simply smiled back. Leo added that once he grew stronger, he might become an adventurer, or, if necessary, join Cody's division first. After all, judging from Theo's determination, his twin also seemed set on becoming an adventurer. But Haruka could sense the uncertainty beneath Leo's words. Even close twins might walk separate paths someday. That wasn't something to fear. Haruka promised she would keep polishing her skills, strengthening her magical structure. To lift his spirits, she extended her hand, offering a pact. Someday, they would talk about magic like this again, a promise between friends. Leo's heart lightened, and he returned the handshake with a small smile. They vowed to grow stronger and meet again somewhere in the future, hopefully under good circumstances. Hours later, the farewell party came to an end. Many adventurers passed out from exhaustion or too much alcohol. Haruka lifted Albert and Corin effortlessly, both fast asleep. Cody offered help, but she didn't need it. Then, Montana leaped onto her back as well, demanding to be carried. Meanwhile, Cody carried Theo and wished Haruka well, looking forward to meeting again. Haruka walked calmly toward the inn, carrying 3 children without breaking a sweat, shocking everyone who passed. Their first expedition had been unexpectedly smooth and fruitful, and now another journey was about to begin. Smiling up at the night sky, Haruka felt the excitement rising. A new adventure waited ahead. The next morning, Geets arrived at the meeting spot bursting with energy, greeting Haruka and the others with barely contained excitement. He looked more than ready to depart, until Haruka noticed the mountain of luggage he was hauling behind him. She could only shake her head in disbelief. It was absurdly excessive. Geets immediately defended himself, insisting everything was essential since they would be walking the entire day. He reminded them he came from a martial noble family, and according to him, Haruka's concern bordered on insulting. Corin had already warned him about overpacking, but clearly it had done nothing. Left speechless, Haruka gave up and simply suggested he change into more suitable shoes, preferably not ones designed for ballroom dancing. Geets resisted, but Haruka pointed out he would regret it the moment they started moving. Just as he stepped forward to change them, Geets suddenly pitched forward and crashed to the ground. Albert calmly informed him the luggage was too heavy, which caused the fall. The nobleman stubbornly denied it, claiming he had only tripped, then quickly switched to more practical boots. At that moment, Sarah arrived, her arms overflowing with bags, shouting good morning as she approached. Haruka stared in shock, demanding to know what she wanted and why she was carrying so much. With unwavering determination in her eyes, Sarah declared that she wanted to join their journey. The dark elf asked for a reason, and Sarah claimed she had promised to serve Haruka. Even though Haruka refused, Sarah insisted she couldn't break her vow. Haruka didn't buy it. She crouched to meet Sarah's eyes, serious and unyielding, and demanded the real reason, something stronger than a promise. Finally, Sarah confessed, clutching the strap of her bag with trembling hands. She said she had dreamed of Haruka, living in a mansion deep in the forest. In the dream, an older version of Sarah was there with her. Then, a black-haired child burst into the room in a panic, and outside, a colossal dragon was descending from the sky. It lunged directly toward them, and in the terror of the moment, Sarah cast a massive barrier spell. But the dream ended there, and she woke up shaking. Fear and worry lingered in her expression. Haruka recognized the dream as prophetic. Sarah didn't know whether it would truly come to pass, but she believed that if she continued living a normal life in Vista, she would never be able to cast that spell in time. She needed to act now, to prepare. Haruka studied her in silence for a long moment. She understood Sarah's intentions were genuine, but in the end, Haruka told her she couldn't take her along. Sarah's face fell instantly. She assumed she would only become a burden, but Haruka quickly cut that thought short. She admitted she was still insecure as an adventurer and wasn't confident she could keep Sarah safe. Before ending the conversation, Haruka asked one last question. How old was Sarah in the dream? Sarah estimated 17 or 18, about Haruka's current age. Hearing Sarah's answer, relief washed through Haruka. She offered the girl a small, gentle smile, telling her they could revisit the matter in 3 years. There was plenty of time. By then, Haruka hoped she and her friends would be far more prepared, and Sarah could strengthen her magic as well. If, at that time, they were still not strong enough, then they could consider traveling together. But Sarah clearly still wanted to go now. Haruka asked one final question. Had she even asked her parents for permission? Sarah's face drained of color, her shoulders trembling as she whispered a confession. She hadn't told them at all. Haruka sighed and reminded her that if she disappeared, Haruka would likely be accused of kidnapping, which would only make things far worse. Sarah let out a long, heavy breath, eyes filled with worry, and asked if Haruka truly would come back for her. The dark elf responded with a soft smile, promising they would meet again once they were both stronger. In the end, Sarah surrendered to the decision and vowed to work hard from now on. When they met again, she swore she would be someone useful to Haruka. They parted ways. Haruka knew Sarah must be drowning in anxiety and impatience, but taking her along would have been the wrong choice. Even Haruka felt uneasy, afraid she might have hurt Sarah with her words. She was still insecure, not yet strong or capable enough to protect her. Suddenly, Geets called out to Haruka, asking whether they would stay at an inn that night, and how much farther they needed to walk. The nobleman looked like he was on the verge of collapse, struggling under the ridiculous weight of his luggage. With a sigh, Haruka asked if they should rest for a moment, but Geets, clinging to his pride, insisted he needed no break, despite his uneven breathing and rapidly paling face. Albert had predicted this would happen, though it was alarming that they had walked only a few hours. Montana whispered that something felt off. He knew the Huber family was full of martial artists, yet from Geets' terrible posture, stiff movements, and inexperienced handling of weight, Montana doubted he had ever trained properly. His hands were far too clean. He showed his own hands, covered in calluses and scars, to prove the point. Albert agreed completely. Albert asked if they believed Geets was a fraud, trying to deceive them. Corin hesitated. Who would risk impersonating a noble? But the more they considered his behavior, the more plausible it seemed. Haruka looked back at Geets lagging behind and noted that Cody had referred him, so he was probably legitimate, just suspicious. When they finally reached the inn, Geets collapsed face first onto the bed. Albert asked whether he planned to eat, otherwise his body would fail tomorrow, but Geets groaned that he couldn't even stand. He felt utterly destroyed. Feeling pity, Haruka stepped forward to try healing magic. She had learned the basics from Leo, but had never used it before. Approaching the bed, she positioned her palm over Geets' legs, which were clearly throbbing, and began chanting. Light bloomed around his injuries, and the wounds vanished instantly. Shocked, Geets shot upright in a burst of excitement. He shouted and clenched his fists, stunned not only by the disappearance of pain, but also that every trace of exhaustion had vanished completely, as if he had never been tired at all. He declared it was large-scale magic and demanded to know how Haruka could cast something so powerful without collapsing. Energized beyond belief, he immediately called for Albert to hurry downstairs with him to find food. Corin turned to Haruka, quietly pointing out that her healing magic seemed a bit too effective, practically excessive. It dawned on Haruka then that healing magic might require moderation as well. The next morning, Geets bounced back to his usual cheerful self, suddenly full of energy to continue their journey. Haruka and the others quickly noticed that his luggage looked much lighter than before. He must have realized his mistake from the first day, but when Albert tried asking about it, he dodged the topic completely. Their path carried them through sweeping grasslands and golden wheat fields, past quiet houses on the edge of town. They walked while admiring the scenery with bright, eager eyes. Soon enough, they reached the forest. Haruka naturally took the lead, being the most reliable with directions, while Montana shifted into hunting mode, tracking small animals for their dinner. As the sun dipped low, Corin asked Haruka to dig a pit. She was eager to try what she had learned from Leo. With a focused gesture, she cast a spell over the ground, and the earth quickly gave way, forming a neat, shallow hole. Nearby, Albert and Geets worked on lighting the fire. The noble attempted a basic fire spell, but the flame flickered out again and again. Albert asked if he truly couldn't make something stronger. A little embarrassed, Geets claimed it was only a warm-up and told him to watch carefully. Yet his second attempt was no better. The weak spark couldn't catch on the pile of wood at all. Haruka felt a little sorry for him and stepped closer. The real issue, she explained gently, was that he was trying to burn green wood, infamously difficult to ignite. She lifted a few dry twigs, suggesting they start with small kindling. Once the flame took hold, they slowly added logs, and in moments, a strong campfire blazed. Geets listened intently, as though the knowledge was entirely new to him. Realizing how obvious that looked, he hastily brushed it off, insisting he already knew, and was merely testing the adventurers. Dinner followed soon after. rabbit soup from Montana's hunt, cooked carefully by Korin. Geets commented carelessly that as long as food was edible, that was what mattered. The half-hearted praise stung like an insult, and Korin bristled, reminding him that the meal was for the group. He didn't have to eat it. The noble was stunned, asking if it wasn't natural for them to prepare his meals. Korin laughed sharply. Their contract was escort work only. Everything else was his own responsibility. Shock washed over Geets's face. He took the words fully to heart. Haruka added that if he wanted them to handle extra duties, he would need to increase their payment. Maybe he hadn't heard that properly when they explained it before departure. His expression dimmed. He grew quiet, apologizing softly before excusing himself to sleep early. Korin watched him go, confused by his sudden silence. Haruka didn't think much of it. Maybe he just needed time to reflect. Days passed as they continued through dense forests and climbing hills. One night, Geets watched Albert train with his sword beneath the moonlight. Fascinated, he wondered how Albert managed to practice every single day. Without stopping his swings, Albert pushed himself to keep improving, explaining that effort was the only path to strength. He wanted to grow stronger to become a true adventurer, yet that simple answer failed to satisfy Geets, who stared at him with a lingering, restless curiosity. Albert lowered his sword and looked directly at Geets. There was nothing wrong with having a simple reason, as long as it was enough to push him to grow stronger each day. The word struck Geets harder than expected. He froze, eyes widening in surprise, then muttered that someone as simple-minded as Albert should have been born into his family instead. His grip tightened on the sword without realizing it, and his expression clouded over, somber, weighted with something unspoken. Albert and Haruka exchanged puzzled glances, unsure what storm was turning inside the noble's mind. But in his own quiet way, Geets was beginning to learn. His luggage grew lighter, his unnecessary chatter faded. He started paying for his own meals properly. After learning to choose dry firewood and build a campfire, he even began preparing it himself. And most surprising of all, one night he didn't just watch Albert's practice from the side. He began to raise his own sword and join in. Albert asked if he even knew how to handle a blade. Geets scoffed, reminding him he was the heir of House Huber. Yet hesitation showed in the way he held the weapon, and his swing through the air was clumsy and slow. Albert decided to teach him. The next day, they safely crossed the border. But when distant animal cries echoed, wolves from the sound of it, Geets's face paled. Haruka reassured him that they had fought wolves before. Wild animals were nothing they couldn't handle. Suddenly, Montana's ears twitched. Alert, he spun around, warning that something was coming. Haruka quickly pulled Geets behind her to shield him. Panic flickered across the noble's face. Were monsters attacking? Wolves? The bushes rustled. A deer burst out and sprinted away. Geets let out a breath of relief, but Haruka knew Montana wouldn't react so sharply to just a deer. In the next instant, the beastman lunged, tackling Geets's legs. Geets crashed backward and blacked out from the impact. Haruka stared in shock at Montana's sudden action, but the reason revealed itself as Korin and Albert sensed movement approaching. An arrow sliced past Haruka, narrowly missing her, before burying itself in a tree trunk. Albert shouted for the dark elf to move. There were several armed figures ahead, rushing toward them. Bandits, their next enemy. While Geets lay unconscious, his body was placed a short distance behind Haruka's group. Ahead of them, the bandits charged closer with brutal speed. Weapons raised and eyes full of violence. Korin was the first to react. She did not hesitate, loosing an arrow from her bow that tore into the stomach of the nearest bandit. An immediate counterattack followed. An arrow flew from the enemy's side and nearly struck Montana, but the beastman dropped low with sharp reflexes, drawing his dagger in one smooth motion. He sprinted forward, and before his attacker could react, Montana slashed deep into the right side of the bandit's body. The man collapsed in agony. Nearby, Albert was far from a bystander, cutting down another enemy with a clean strike to the abdomen. Albert had clearly changed. He was no longer confused or stiff on the battlefield. Instead, he moved with growing confidence, calmly reading attacks from behind and dispatching enemies quickly and without hesitation. From farther back, Haruka provided support using floating stones. Her attacks did not kill outright, but bodies soon began to litter the ground. As the scene grew bloodier, Haruka started to feel unsteady, nausea creeping up from deep inside her chest. The bandits eventually chose to retreat, turning and fleeing to save their lives. Panic surged through Haruka. Letting them escape felt dangerous, as revenge could come later. Despite her hesitation, she enchanted more floating stones around her and aimed them at the remaining bandits with clear intent to kill. Yet the fear on their faces made her chest tighten, disrupting her focus. The stone, meant to crush a skull, seemed to follow her wavering emotions and flew far past its target instead. Driven by her magic, the stone smashed into a massive tree, standing ahead of the fleeing bandits. Haruka realized what had happened only after hearing their panicked screams. Some managed to escape, but others were not fast enough. One unfortunate man fell, unable to dodge, his face frozen in horror and despair as he reached out helplessly in his final moment. Haruka stood stunned, eyes wide and body locked in place. A second later, the giant tree collapsed with a thunderous crash, crushing the bandit beneath it. Through gaps in the broken wood, Haruka saw fresh blood spilling out in thick streams. By the time the others finished off the remaining bandits, Haruka could barely breathe. Her pupils shrank, her heart hammered violently, and the memory of that final expression burned into her mind. Her body grew cold, her chest tightened, and nausea overwhelmed her until she started coughing, crushed under the weight of guilt. Korin quickly noticed and rushed to her, calling Haruka's name repeatedly as panic crept into her voice. The dark elf eventually snapped back to awareness, staring blankly at Korin as she checked her over. Haruka was unable to speak, still trapped in her discomfort, but Korin understood without words. She gripped Haruka's hand tightly, cold sweat soaking her skin, and gently led her away from the battlefield. She guided her to sit beneath the shade of the trees. Without hesitation, Korin wrapped her arms around Haruka, pulling her trembling body close and offering warmth, safety, and quiet reassurance. For a while, Korin said nothing, only holding her and softly stroking her hair, drawn to its unexpected softness. Eventually, she suggested that they rest and eat. Once Haruka seemed calmer, Korin urged her to stay there and close her eyes while she prepared camp for the day. Haruka felt guilty and wanted to help, but when she tried to stand, her vision blurred. Only then did she realize that tears had been streaming down her face. Korin smiled with understanding and told her to rest. Haruka was shocked by her own tears, and the more she tried to suppress them, the harder they fell. Feeling ashamed, she wiped her face, stood up, and apologized for being a burden, insisting that she felt better now. Korin let out a long breath, chose not to force her, and guided her back to the others. As they walked, Haruka was consumed by overwhelming embarrassment. The image of a grown man breaking down in tears while being held by a much younger girl filled her with deep shame. When they returned, Haruka saw Albert and Montana discussing whether to burn the fallen tree, along with the human remains still sticking out of it. Fearing the corpse might turn undead if left alone, Haruka offered to move the tree herself, steadying her resolve. By sunset, they had burned the wood and all the bodies together. Haruka watched the flames and let out a heavy breath. She realized she had never prepared herself to kill anyone, and the weight of it felt unbearable. Still, she was grateful that all her companions were safe and seemingly unharmed, both physically and mentally. She felt naive for her thoughts. Even without wanting to justify killing, this world demanded an understanding that sometimes it could not be avoided to protect what mattered. She understood that this reality had to be faced with courage, because every choice carried risk. Her reflection was interrupted when Korin suddenly suggested using the fire to cook. Haruka immediately created a new flame instead, silently wishing that one day she could become as strong as Korin and the others. That night, after Geets finally regained consciousness, the group explained why they had been forced to knock him out earlier. When he asked where the bandits had gone, Albert answered casually while eating, stating that they were kill them. Geets clearly was not accustomed to the idea of killing. He fell silent for a long moment, his face pale. Albert added calmly that it was simply how things worked. If the bandits had not died, then it might have been them instead. Geets let out a quiet sigh and acknowledged Albert's words, and after that, everyone settled down to rest. Near midnight, while sleeping peacefully, Haruka woke up feeling slightly cramped. she soon realized that Albert and Montana had ended up sleeping very close beside her. The dark elf slowly sat up and smiled at the sight of the two boys sleeping soundly. When she looked toward the campfire, she noticed that Korin and Geets were still awake. Haruka approached them, startling Korin slightly, who told her to go back to sleep. Haruka refused. What surprised her more was that Geets, their client, was also still awake. Geets admitted that he could not sleep and confessed that he was not used to conflict. After drifting into thought for a moment, he explained that he had always preferred academic pursuits and dreamed of becoming a researcher or teacher. However, as the eldest son of a noble family, he had never been allowed to choose his own path. Hearing this, Korin and Haruka felt that his behavior finally made sense. Geets then explained the reason behind the strange conditions he had set when hiring them, beginning with a story from his childhood. The Hubner family was known as a martial household. From a young age, Geets had been subjected to daily combat training, barely enduring it under the strict discipline of his father. Though he disliked it, his nursemaid and tutors treated him kindly, as they had all been close to his late mother. There was a period when his father was summoned to the front lines and stayed away from home for some time. Geets took that chance to lie to his tutors, claiming that his father had ordered him to focus on studying instead of training. 5 years passed before he realized it, until a letter arrived announcing his father's imminent return. Panic struck him. The brutal training would resume. To escape it, Geets decided to study abroad at the Oracle Academy. Unfortunately, even there, he received another letter from his father, stating that his lack of training had been discovered and that he was to return home immediately after graduation. Forced into a corner, Geets began training alone so he would not be completely helpless when he returned, despite how exhausting it was. Then came another letter. This time, his father demanded that Geets return without guards and spar with him directly. If Geets lost or performed poorly, he would be forced to marry a woman chosen by his father. Worse still, that wife would be granted full authority over the household. Tears welled up as Geets finished his story, finally releasing years of pent-up frustration. His head throbbed at the thought of being bound to someone he had never met. In a moment of desperation, he lightly suggested that Korin or Haruka pretend to be his fiancée, an idea that was immediately rejected without hesitation. Haruka silently thought that Geets' situation was truly hopeless. Even so, she had no intention of staying involved with him. Still, considering the progress he had shown during their journey, she felt that if he continued to grow, crossing paths again in the future would not necessarily be a bad thing. By the next morning, they finally arrived at Schubalt, with only the city gate left ahead of them. Geets smiled in satisfaction, pleased that everything had gone exactly according to schedule. He reminded them once more that if anyone asked, they were to say they had only met recently and had not been hired. Haruka looked around and noticed many armed individuals in the area, likely because the martial arts festival was approaching. Among them, she even spotted someone dressed like a samurai. As the group continued walking together, Haruka failed to notice that the people around them had begun to move away. Feeling something strange, the dark elf turned around in confusion. She froze in shock. The road behind them had opened neatly, with people pressing themselves to the sides. Even her companions had stepped aside. From the distance, Haruka saw a tall man approaching. He had jet black hair, a cold expression, and 2 swords strapped across his back. He walked forward calmly and with unwavering confidence. It felt as though everyone was deliberately making way for him. As he drew closer, their gazes locked. Haruka remained confused, while the stranger's sharp stare pierced straight through her. Her body jolted slightly. She wanted to step back, but found it difficult to move. She realized she could not look away, overwhelmed by an intense sense of fear, as if a single wrong move would provoke an attack. In just a few steps, the man stood directly before her. Up close, his build was far larger than hers, completely overshadowing her despite her height. He looked down at Haruka and warned her to watch where she was going, his deep baritone voice heavy and imposing. His brow lifted slightly in brief surprise when Haruka tilted her head in confusion. His expression softened just a little, and he let out a small chuckle, asking if she was all right. Still not fully understanding, Haruka nodded. The man no longer looked at her, waved lightly, and walked away, Only after he left did the people around them begin to close in again. Albert, in particular, was confused, unaware of what had happened to him. His body had moved aside on its own, and he had only realized something was wrong when he saw Haruka interacting with the strange man. He wondered who that man was. Geets, however, did not seem very surprised and muttered that the man might have been Kudan. Korin immediately dismissed the idea, pointing out that Kudan was a legendary adventurer from stories over 100 years ago, and there was no way he could still look that young. Haruka quickly opened her notebook and found her own notes about Kudan. He was known as the Unfalling and the Head-Hunting Wolf, a man who once beat a king simply because he disliked the king's attitude. Kudan Tuhak was described as a mysterious special-class adventurer, a lone wolf of overwhelming strength. Haruka briefly wondered whether the man she had encountered earlier would participate in the martial arts festival. She quickly dismissed the thought. With an aura that overwhelming, any competition would become inherently unfair. When they reached the city gate, Geets confidently bid them farewell and reminded them once again to keep their relationship secret. Albert, clearly annoyed, reminded Geets to report their mission's success to the guild. Korin watched as Geets passed through the gate without inspection, confirming that he truly was a high-ranking noble. Beyond the gate, Haruka noticed many adventurers and fighters arguing over trivial matters. The scene strangely resembled delinquent brawls from manga. While waiting in line to enter, a man suddenly cut in front of her. He glanced at Haruka and smirked with open contempt. Albert, who witnessed this clearly, refused to tolerate it and loudly protested. The stranger showed no fear at all. He mocked Albert, calling him a spoiled young master, deliberately provoking him by claiming his voice was too weak. Albert's temper flared instantly. The stranger stepped closer, clearly judging Albert as an easy target due to his smaller frame. They locked eyes for several tense seconds, silently assessing one another. Without warning, the larger man delivered a powerful punch to Albert's stomach. Haruka cried out from behind, the impact sounding painfully solid. To the attacker's surprise, Albert did not collapse in pain. Instead, his eyes sharpened with defiance. A moment later, Albert threw an uppercut aimed at the man's face. It narrowly missed, avoided at the last second. Albert clicked his tongue in frustration, while the larger man laughed in clear enjoyment. It seemed that the stranger genuinely liked Albert's courage and toughness. Before long, the two were exchanging blows freely. Haruka quietly asked Korin whether it was really acceptable to let such a disturbance continue. Korin merely shrugged, believing the man was venting his impatience for the upcoming festival through a fight. Judging by the surroundings, many people were doing the same. Haruka observed more closely and realized that neither of them had drawn a weapon. This was not a serious battle. Reassured, she decided to enter the gate first, leaving Albert behind. Haruka and the others waited at a nearby cafe. Not long after, Albert arrived with his former opponent. Both of them injured, yet laughing together, arms slung over each other's shoulders. Despite their wounds, they praised each other's strength enthusiastically. The large man introduced himself as Oktai, a rank 2 adventurer. Oktai explained that he had been surprised to see a dark elf in the area and wanted to put on a good fighting display. However, Albert had proven strong enough to satisfy him, even though Haruka had walked away mid-fight. Oktai bowed respectfully toward Haruka, stating that where he came from, dark elves were seen as bringers of good fortune. Korin questioned whether that belief stemmed from Haruka's racial rarity. Oktai laughed and denied it. Dark elves symbolized battle itself, a race that had held back destructive invasions in the southern forests for generations. In his hometown, they were revered almost like guardian deities. Haruka let out a quiet sigh. She knew she could never live up to such an image, not as she was now, merely an ordinary aging man, reborn into a strange world. Oktai then asked out of pure curiosity why a dark elf who rarely left the forest had traveled so far north. Before Haruka could respond, her attention shifted to Albert, who was wincing in pain. She immediately healed him, discovering that one of his ribs had been broken during the fight. Seeing this, Oktai asked whether his own injuries could be healed as well, showing 2 broken fingers. Haruka stared at Albert in disbelief, while Albert simply smiled with pride. Before Haruka could act, Korin intervened with an innocent and gentle smile, requesting that the healing fee be paid to her. Haruka whispered that it should be free since Albert had caused the injury, but Korin subtly signaled that this was a perfect opportunity to earn extra money. Octai apologized, explaining that he did not have much cash on hand and offered something else instead. From beneath his cloak, he produced a wide, shovel-shaped scale. Korin immediately recognized it as a dragon scale. If genuine, it would be worth no less than 10 gold coins. Haruka instinctively calculated that amount to be comparable to an entire year's earnings back in her previous world. Wealth truly came easily here. Korin accepted the payment happily, and Octai extended his broken fingers to be healed. The adventurer was delighted, remarking that he had recovered instantly for such a cheap price. Korin narrowed her eyes in disbelief. Octai laughed, reminding her that as a rank 2 adventurer, he should have paid far more, especially considering the usual recovery time. From his perspective, this deal was incredibly advantageous. Realizing this too late, Korin groaned loudly in frustration at her missed chance to charge more. Before leaving, Octai recommended a skilled blacksmith in the city named Marto, whose expertise was widely recognized across the country. The name sounded familiar to Haruka and the others. They instinctively looked at Montana, who averted his gaze. Octai studied the beastman closely before suddenly recognizing him. He remembered a small boy who once claimed to have a dwarf father. Montana clicked his tongue and turned away in irritation. Octai tried to sling an arm around him in greeting, but Montana dodged sharply, his tail bristling like a hissing cat. He pretended not to know Octai at all. Accepting the rejection, Octai finally bid the group farewell. He bumped fists with Albert, expressing hope that they would meet again in the martial arts festival. After Octai left, Korin cautiously asked whether Montana had a personal issue with him. With an annoyed sigh, Montana explained that when he was young, Octai and his group had once visited their workshop. Octai had been rough and borderline bullying toward him. Being questioned about his race, which differed from his father's, had only made it worse. Even though Montana was adopted, the experience left a lasting sting. Afterward, his father forbade him from entering the workshop again, worried he would be mocked. The memory still left Montana deeply irritated to this day. Putting Octai out of their minds, the group hurried toward the city guild. Albert planned to register immediately for the fighting festival, but loud shouting reached their ears before they arrived. Curious, the 4 of them peeked from behind a wall and saw a heated argument between a woman and a group of men. The woman looked fierce. She wore clothing resembling that of a nun, yet a long scar ran across her face. Heavy boxing gloves covered her hands, and a cigarette rested casually between her slender fingers. She took a deep drag and stared down the men in front of her, mocking them and suggesting that they withdraw from the festival entirely if they were already trembling just facing her alone. Her appearance and attitude stunned Haruka and the others. The contrast between her religious attire and violent demeanor felt like deliberate provocation. As expected, one of the men snapped and rushed forward to punch her. The woman only laughed in delight. In a single motion, she pulled out a massive spiked warhammer from her back and swung it with terrifying force. The blow sent the attacker flying, crashing into 2 of his companions. Without pause, the frightening nun kicked all 3 of them away effortlessly, sending them tumbling past Albert and the others, who stood frozen in shock. She laughed loudly, clearly unimpressed by opponents she regarded as little more than worms. After returning her weapon to her back, she calmly walked past Haruka and the others as if nothing had happened. Haruka and Korin could not help but stare after her, stunned by both her presence and overwhelming strength. Albert, on the other hand, looked more energized than ever. What he had just witnessed only fueled his motivation. Powerful fighters from all backgrounds were gathering in the city. He immediately asked Montana to train with him right away. Korin could only sigh at his enthusiasm. Haruka finally understood why Albert seemed so fired up. This city promised many encounters yet to come. Korin decided the group would split up for a while and suggested that she and Haruka go explore the city in search of good food. Following local recommendations, they arrived at a large, luxurious-looking building. At first, both hesitated, but having come this far, they gathered their courage and entered. The moment they opened the door, a restaurant attendant greeted them and promptly asked about their reservation and who had recommended them. Haruka and Korin exchanged awkward glances. It quickly became clear that this was an exclusive establishment not open to just anyone. Disappointed, they decided to leave and look elsewhere. Before they could step out, they nearly collided with Kudan, who was entering. He immediately recognized Haruka. Korin, meanwhile, was completely stunned and froze for a moment. Kudan was accompanied by a well-dressed middle-aged man who carried the refined air of a noble. Haruka politely explained that they were leaving because they lacked a recommendation. Kudan exchanged a glance with the man beside him and casually told the attendant to add Haruka and Korin to his table. The noble then turned slightly and invited them inside, indicating that if they wished to eat there, they should join him. Haruka wanted to refuse. The situation felt intimidating, and she tried to excuse herself, worried about causing trouble. However, the noble's calm gaze and subtle pressure left no room for rejection. They followed him inside. Once seated, the man introduced himself as Folka Hubner. He confirmed that he was a noble who had recently been promoted to Viscount. From his name alone, Haruka and Korin immediately understood that he was Geets's father. Without hesitation, Folka asked whether they were the adventurers who had protected his son during the journey to the city. Neither Haruka nor Korin dared to answer at first, but Folka reassured them. He already knew and had already disciplined his foolish son. He sighed softly, looking somewhat troubled, and admitted that he may have spoiled Geets too much because he was his only child. Haruka was taken aback. Folka was nothing like she had imagined. Based on Geets's stories, she had expected a rigid and conventional man. Instead, Folka seemed like an ordinary father, with a calm, intellectual presence. Before long, the food arrived. A wide variety of dishes filled the table. Haruka eagerly sampled everything, finding the flavors rich and vibrant, reminiscent of Middle Eastern cuisine compared to her previous world. As they ate, Folka asked whether Haruka planned to participate in the martial arts festival. She replied that only her companions had registered. Folka expressed regret, remarking that she could easily become a champion and put on a remarkable display. His comment referred to her ability to stand calmly and speak without averting her gaze during her first encounter with Kudan. Curious, Haruka asked what Kudan had been doing at the city gate earlier. That man explained he had merely released a small amount of aura to intimidate people and push them away to prevent trouble. He then looked directly at Haruka and noted that such intimidation would not work on those who were either extremely dull or possessed great power. Haruka felt self-conscious again and lowered her gaze, thinking she must belong to the dull category. Kudan responded only with a low laugh and offered no further explanation. Korin, who had been listening intently, could no longer hold back and nervously asked whether Kudan had truly fought a real dragon. The lone wolf answered plainly that he had. Korin's eyes lit up, and she excitedly asked whether cutting off the dragon's tail had secured his victory. Kudan's expression turned irritated. He explained that he had severed tails, arms, legs, and horns, yet they always grew back. It had been a brutally difficult battle. Hearing this, Haruka recalled Sarah's prophecy about a colossal dragon they might one day face. It was hard to imagine standing against such a terrifying being. Her thoughts shifted when she noticed Korin glowing with excitement as she continued to ask about Kudan's dangerous adventures. Haruka felt quietly happy seeing her friend so animated. After lunch, Haruka thanked them for the meal and spoke honestly. The life of a special class adventurer felt frightening to her. Kudan looked at her for a moment as if considering his words, then let out a short sigh. He said that high-ranking adventurers were no different from ordinary people. He told her not to change her perception of them and to simply think of them as a group of strange individuals. Haruka smiled softly and replied that even so, Kudan seemed like a good person. The comment clearly caught him off guard. He stiffened, unable to respond, then turned away without another word, giving a brief wave in farewell. Folka followed, offering a more polite and composed goodbye. After they left, Korin could not stop talking about how incredible Kudan was. Haruka laughed, noting that her reaction was no different from Albert's. Elsewhere, Folka lightly teased Kudan, knowing that the cold adventurer was secretly pleased that someone had listened to his stories without judging him by appearances alone. The remark struck true, leaving Kudan both irritated and embarrassed. Later, when Haruka and Korin shared their experience with Albert and Montana, Both of them grew openly annoyed. They had wanted to meet the legendary adventurer themselves. Missing that chance felt like a true shame. At the inn, Corin wondering whether Albert could reach the finals of the martial festival tomorrow. Albert had trained relentlessly, pushing himself every day. Meanwhile, Haruka quietly turned her face away and asked permission to go for a walk since Corin wanted to bathe. It was only an excuse born from shyness. Without waiting long, she slipped out and left Corin behind. As Haruka wandered through the garden, she noticed that the entire place was filled with couples openly dating and clinging to each other. The sight made her uncomfortable, yet she could not return until Corin finished bathing. While walking aimlessly, she noticed someone sitting on a bench, releasing a deep and heavy sigh. From a distance, the figure appeared to be a young man. His posture looked weighed down, his gaze empty and unfocused. When Haruka looked closer, she noticed his striking glowing red eyes and jet black hair. He was undeniably handsome, yet carried an air of exhaustion. The young man soon realized he was being watched and turned his head toward the dark elf. His expression grew serious as he warned that walking alone at night could be dangerous and asked whether Haruka had business with him. Haruka explained that she was simply taking a walk and politely asked if she could sit beside him. The young man hesitated, suspecting she might have ulterior motives, but Haruka calmly reassured him that she had no interest in such things. In the end, they sat on the same bench, though an awkward silence settled between them. Haruka found herself unable to start a conversation. She stole brief glances at him and sensed that he was deeply lost in thought. The sight stirred memories from her past, reminding her of a subordinate who had once acted the same way before suddenly quitting. Haruka had been too afraid to speak up back then. Not long after, that subordinate took his own life. The memory left her with lingering regret, and she feared the same tragedy might repeat itself. Yet she had no idea how to begin. Just as those thoughts overwhelmed her, the young man stood up and excused himself, saying he would head back. Haruka decided to return as well, but a strange unease tightened in her chest. Gathering her courage, she finally spoke, offering to listen if he ever felt troubled or burdened by something. The black-haired youth froze, then turned back in surprise. He let out a small laugh, clearly not expecting that she had been thinking so hard about what to say. Relief washed over Haruka when she saw his reaction. She apologized, worried that her words might have sounded too forward. In the end, they introduced themselves properly. Haruka shared her name first. The young man then introduced himself as Easton Houtman, a traveling wanderer. A quiet yet sincere friendship began to form between them. Haruka promised that she would listen to his story someday, while Easton assured her that he would be willing to help if she ever needed it. After their brief exchange, they parted ways. As Haruka left, she could feel Easton's gaze lingering on her from afar. The next morning, the long-awaited festival finally arrived. Citizens flooded into the grand arena, their excitement overflowing as they gathered to witness the battles. A moderator opened the event with booming enthusiasm, drawing loud applause from the crowd. He then introduced Kudan, the legendary guest of honor. Despite the fanfare, the famed figure responded with nothing more than a sour expression. The moderator explained that the tournament featured powerful fighters from many regions. From the spectator seats, Haruka, Corin, and Montana waited eagerly for the matches to begin. When the trumpet sounded, signaling the start of the first qualification round, the fighters charged at one another with fierce aggression. From above, it was easy to notice one young man who stood out. While others fought wildly, he remained calm and clearly superior. Haruka could not tear her eyes away from him. He stood at the center as multiple opponents rushed him brutally. When he clashed swords with one fighter, his movements were elegant and fluid. He defended and attacked at the same time, effortlessly dodging thrusts with a relaxed, crooked smile. A powerful kick sent his opponent crashing to the ground. Haruka held her breath throughout the match, and when the final enemy fell, another trumpet echoed through the arena. The man raised his fist into the air in victory, drawing thunderous applause from the crowd. The first qualification round was claimed by a knight of the Grolsa Empire. Haruka did not clap. Her eyes remained locked on the arena. Corin laughed softly, knowing that Haruka was thrilled to witness the spectacle firsthand. Haruka herself felt confused. She despised conflict and violence, yet her heart raced as she watched. The second qualification round soon began. Several fighters entered the arena, and Montana was the first to notice a familiar face among them. Albert had spotted his friends in the stands as well, and flashed them a confident smile, which Corin answered with loud cheers. The battle erupted, blades clashing in every direction. One fighter rushed toward Albert from behind, and Haruka instinctively shouted a warning. Albert had already sensed the attack, and turned in time to strike his opponent back. Corin reminded Haruka not to worry so much about him. Even so, Haruka could not help but fear whether Albert could truly win. Corin recalled Albert's own words, saying that if someone knew for certain whether they would win or lose, it would not be a real fight. Haruka watched in awe as Albert endured each assault and struck back with unwavering determination. The scene was dazzling, filled with fighters who challenged one another by their own will. Albert brought down his enemies one by one, steadily and without hesitation. For reasons Haruka could not explain, her chest burned and thundered with emotion. Only two opponents remained. One stood before Albert, while another swung an axe from behind. Albert hurled the enemy in front of him backward, blocking the axe wielder's movement. The maneuver worked perfectly, forcing the attacker to focus on keeping his balance. In that exact moment, Albert delivered his strongest punch straight to the man's head. The sheer force of the blow and Albert's sharp strategy left the audience stunned. His opponent collapsed, and even Kudan appeared satisfied as he observed Albert's technique. Albert looked toward his friend's seats, a wide grin spreading across his face. Haruka could not deny the pride swelling within her. With the moderator's powerful shout, Albert was declared the winner of the second qualification round. Once again, the arena erupted in roaring cheers. The matches were temporarily halted for a break. Haruka and the others struggled to find Albert amid the swelling crowd. When they finally spotted him, he was already surrounded by spectators praising his performance and eagerly anticipating his match the next day. Seeing Albert's radiant smile as he received their admiration filled Haruka with overwhelming pride. Being recognized by so many people made his victory feel even more real to her. Albert soon noticed his friends and approached them, casually handing some of the snacks he had received from his supporters to Corin. Haruka congratulated him, even though it was only the qualification round. The atmosphere had been so intense that she had not even realized she had stood up and clapped loudly when his name was announced as the winner. Despite all the praise, Albert admitted that he was not fully satisfied with himself. He believed his victory was possible only because he followed Montana's advice, using a strategy that avoided fighting too many opponents at once to conserve energy. He was unsure whether that truly counted as his own strength. Haruka gently reassured him that listening to a friend's advice and executing a strategy properly was also a sign of real ability. Her words made Albert blush slightly, though he still expressed his gratitude. Suddenly, Montana began acting strangely, hiding himself behind Haruka's body. Not far from them, three dwarves were walking closer. One of them looked familiar to Montana, and Haruka herself was momentarily stunned, as it was her first time seeing dwarves in person. Once the three had passed by, Montana whispered that he knew them, but was not yet ready to greet them. Unexpectedly, Haruka reached out and softly patted Montana's head, startling the beastmen. She understood his feelings and suggested they go have lunch first, which visibly eased his tension. Several hours later, the afternoon matches began. Easton appeared at the center of the arena, and Haruka accidentally blurted out his name, causing Corin to turn toward her in surprise. Haruka explained that she knew the black-haired young man because they had met the previous night. Corin muttered at length, mistakenly assuming that Haruka was interested in Easton, when that was not the case at all. Corin sighed in disappointment, having thought that they were already at the stage of talking about love. For Haruka, however, such matters were still far too difficult. Not long after, the winner of the first afternoon round was announced. Easton emerged victorious after continuously avoiding direct confrontation, leaving it unclear whether it was purely strategy or if he was hiding his true strength. The final match of the day followed soon after, and two fighters immediately drew everyone's attention. The first was Iron Crusher Saintess Regina Cicero, a woman known for her love of battle and her violent temper. Albert and the others recognized her at once. As soon as the fight began, the men in the arena rushed toward Regina together. She responded with a delighted grin. With ease, she sent one attacker flying, then struck down several more in quick succession. A single brutal swing of her weapon knocked dozens of men away, leaving them injured and sprawled across the ground. From her expression alone, it was clear that Regina was enjoying every moment of crushing her opponents. Korin could only gape in disbelief, as her strength seemed far beyond that of a rank 2 adventurer. Just as Regina assumed she had defeated everyone, a massive man twice her size emerged from behind her. When she turned around, excitement ran through her body, raising goosebumps along her skin. The man carried a huge hammer on his shoulder and stared at her with sharp intensity. Without hesitation, the two charged at each other. Their weapons collided with a deafening crash. The man was named Zygmunt, and despite the vast difference in their builds, neither showed any restraint. Regina quickly identified a weakness in Zygmunt's weapon and aimed for its handle. With a single strike, she cracked it, snapping it cleanly in two. She followed up with another blow, which Zygmunt narrowly avoided, smashing a section of the arena wall instead. Zygmunt retaliated, but Regina leaped away just in time. Their exchanged attacks missed repeatedly, leaving parts of the venue badly damaged. The moderator desperately turned toward Kudan, pleading for the match to be stopped. The legendary figure reluctantly agreed. Haruka glanced toward Kudan, wondering how he intended to intervene in such a fierce battle. Her eyes widened when Kudan suddenly leapt high into the air from the balcony where he had been standing. Just as Regina and Zygmunt were about to clash again, both felt an overwhelming sense of danger from above. A split second later, a violent impact shook the arena, followed by thick smoke and a thunderous boom. Kudan landed between them, forcibly ending the fight. Zygmunt managed to evade in time, but Regina was knocked unconscious, left dangling in Kudan's grasp like a helpless cat. He handed her over to the medics. Albert stared in shock, realizing that the sheer force of Kudan's landing alone had rendered Regina unconscious. Unfortunately, the audience did not appreciate the intervention. Booing erupted from the stands as spectators cursed Kudan for stopping the match. One person, driven by anger or impulse, threw a food wrapper that struck the back of Kudan's cloak. Haruka froze in shock, sensing that something terrifying was about to awaken. Kudan glanced down at the wrapper and slowly turned toward the audience. His glare was sharp and horrifying. He shouted, releasing an overwhelming aura that threatened death itself, declaring that they were noisy and that he could kill them all. The immense pressure engulfed the section of the crowd facing him. His focus locked onto the one who had thrown the object, but everyone in that area was affected. Panic spread instantly, and spectators fled the stadium in chaos. Kudan exhaled, seemingly indifferent, and walked into the arena corridor. He crossed his arms and wore a sour, expressionless face, as though nothing significant had happened at all. Haruka watched in silence as the moderator brought the matches to an end. At that moment, Albert suddenly stood up. Unlike the frightened crowd, his eyes burned with determination. He asked his friends for permission to go train on his own again. Korin laughed, remarking that what had just happened should have crushed his spirit. Yet it had achieved the opposite. Haruka agreed. She felt that Kudan had worn the same expression like Albert. Perhaps, deep down, the two men shared the same nature. On the second day of the festival, Albert advanced smoothly through his matches, yet his expression looked unusually gloomy. He admitted to Korin that only the strongest fighters remained, names like Octai and Regina weighing heavily on his mind. The thought alone made his confidence waver. Seeing that hesitation, Korin struck Albert without warning, not out of anger, but deliberately to reignite his fighting spirit. From behind them, a familiar voice called out. It was Geats. For some reason, his right cheek was swollen and red. Albert and the others turned around, clearly unenthusiastic about running into him again. They tried to brush past him, intending to go eat without acknowledging his presence, but Geats stubbornly insisted on talking. In the end, only Korin and Haruka stopped to listen. Geats first revealed that his father had hit him. Then, his expression grew serious as he asked Haruka whether she knew a woman named Eleonora. The name was not unfamiliar. She was one of the finalists in the tournament. Geats sighed deeply and confessed that Eleonora was his fiancée. Korin offered a half-hearted congratulation, which immediately triggered Geet's frustration. He shouted that Eleonora had always defeated him since childhood, and even imagining marriage with her felt like hell. According to him, if Eleonora won the tournament, she would marry him without any conditions. The only way to escape that fate was for her to lose. Without shame, Geets asked Haruka and Korin to make sure Albert fought with everything he had to defeat Eleonora. Hearing that, Haruka's irritation boiled over. She glared sharply at Geets and demanded that he stop dragging his personal problems into Albert's battles. The intense pressure from both Haruka and Korin made Geets shrink back in fear, eventually apologizing. As a desperate alternative, he tried to negotiate, asking Haruka to fight Eleonora in his place and promising 60 gold coins in return. Korin cut in immediately, asking what would happen if Albert won instead. Geets eagerly replied that he would gladly pay 5 gold coins. After that, Geets looked satisfied and excused himself, claiming he had other matters to attend to. Haruka felt uneasy, wondering whether making such promises so casually was truly safe. Korin shrugged, explaining that she had not agreed to anything. She had only asked a question. Haruka remained unsure, asking what they would do if Geets actually handed over the gold. Korin answered firmly that they would accept it without hesitation. She then reminded Haruka that Geets was a noble with connections, trying to make them work without a proper contract. Many adventurers lacked social backing, and the only way to ensure promises were kept was through formal guild contracts. From that perspective, Korin could not really be blamed. Changing the subject, Korin asked about Haruka's plans for the day, since they would have a full day off tomorrow. Haruka decided to explore the city, specifically the bustling central market. She had been eagerly anticipating the countless delicious foods sold there, and had already promised to bring back plenty of souvenirs for Korin and the others. Haruka wandered through the market, sampling everything she could and eventually buying far more than planned. She chewed happily, savoring each piece of street food with pure enjoyment. As she prepared to move on, she suddenly felt someone tug at her clothes. Turning around, she saw a child. At first, she thought he was a lost boy asking for help, but his worn appearance made her understand immediately. Haruka crouched down and explained that she had bought too much food and would give it to him instead. The child looked delighted, yet shy, explaining that he had many younger siblings. Haruka smiled and handed him an entire bag filled with food. She watched as the boy ran joyfully into an alley, sharing the food with several other children. Soon after, Haruka felt her stomach rumble again and searched for a place to sit and eat her lunch. To her surprise, the bench she approached was already occupied by Regina. The woman was smoking, casting Haruka a brief hostile glance. Haruka froze in place, unsure whether to sit or walk away. Embarrassment won over fear, and she forced herself to sit down. She greeted Regina politely, while the ill-tempered woman merely scoffed in response. Haruka began eating, quickly finishing one item after another. Eventually, Regina turned toward her and asked whether eating so much was what made her strong. Haruka was startled by the remark. She did not consider herself strong at all. Her surprise only irritated Regina further, as she could clearly see the overwhelming magical energy radiating around Haruka's body. Regina clicked her tongue in annoyance, muttering that magic users always reinforce their bodies like fools. Haruka was confused. She had never thought about reinforcing her body with magic and admitted honestly that she did not understand what Regina meant. That innocence only seemed to disgust Regina more. She flicked her cigarette to the ground and stood up, turning away as she accused Haruka of refusing to share her methods with someone like her. Without another word, Regina left. From a distance, Haruka watched her retreating back and felt that the woman somehow looked pitiful. Sometime later, Haruka returned to the inn carrying bags of foods. Korin accepted them with sparkling eyes and heartfelt thanks. Just as Haruka was about to talk about her encounter with Regina, Albert burst into the room together with Montana. He wanted to show them something and quietly signaled to the beastmen. Montana immediately punched Albert in the face with all his strength. The sudden and bizarre display left Haruka and Korin speechless. Yet Albert was completely unharmed. He grinned proudly and announced that he had finally figured out how to reinforce his body. Korin reacted with excitement, knowing that such progress must have come from exhausting effort. Albert clicked his tongue, complaining that Montana had known how to do it for a long time and only revealed it now. His expression soon turned serious. He said that his first match tomorrow would be against Eleonora. Hearing the name, Haruka gasped softly. Korin quickly tried to reassure her, saying it was probably just a coincidence. Together, they agreed not to burden Albert with unnecessary information. Haruka then placed a hand on Albert's shoulder and smiled, offering her full support. After a full day of training and proper rest, Albert felt confident that he could face tomorrow's battle at his absolute best. The first match of the festival finals was about to begin. In this stage, participants were allowed to use their usual weapons, but killing an opponent would result in immediate disqualification. Albert stepped into the arena with his heart pounding, his sword strapped across his back. The moment his face appeared, the roar of the crowd flooded his ears. He heard whistles and saw his friends cheering in exaggerated, ridiculous ways. Thanks to them, the nervousness weighing on his chest slowly faded. Albert drew his sword from its sheath and gave it a light swing. His body felt lighter than ever before, likely the result of his newly learned body reinforcement. From the opposite entrance, an elegant woman stepped into the arena, her presence radiating strength. For a brief moment, their gazes met. The moderator introduced her as Eleonora, the eldest daughter of Baron Perle's family. Her main weapons were twin swords, and she was a seasoned veteran of both warfare and tournaments. The moderator then introduced Albert once more, a novice adventurer with a career of less than a year, yet the youngest contestant to reach the finals. From the spectator seats above, Geets could be seen praying desperately for Albert's victory, only to be met with a sharp glance from Eleonora that made him shudder in fear. Haruka could not hide her anxiety. No matter how she looked at it, Eleonora's combat skill and battlefield experience far surpassed Albert's. Korin smiled faintly. He understood that truth as well, but he also knew that Albert was not someone who would back down simply because of it. Facing a stronger opponent meant he could not afford even a moment of hesitation. That was who Albert was. Before the moderator could even finish announcing the start of the match, Albert had already dashed forward to attack. The sudden move shocked Eleonora for a brief instant, along with the audience and even Albert's own friends. Still, Eleonora managed to block and retreat in time. Cheers erupted from the stands as she evaded with graceful movements. Albert clicked his tongue in frustration at his failed opening strike. Eleonora continued to analyze her opponent, but at that moment, she felt a sharp sting. She glanced at the back of her hand and saw a deep cut. Only then did she realize that without body reinforcement magic, she might have lost her hand to that attack. This was not mere youthful recklessness. Albert had deliberately hidden his sword behind his back to disguise its length. Suddenly, Albert charged again, this time swinging his blade toward Eleonora's head. She narrowly avoided it, but from the way he attacked, she began to understand that the boy before her had not reached the finals by chance. Albert pressed on relentlessly, giving her no room to counterattack. Even so, Eleonora's experience prevailed. She slipped inside his guard with her shorter blade and delivered a devastating kick to Albert's chest. The impact echoed through the arena, as though several of his bones had cracked. Haruka clamped her hands over her mouth to stop herself from screaming. Albert also stifled his cry of pain as best he could. Eleonora stepped back, restoring distance and ending the brutal exchange. Albert wiped the blood from his mouth and cursed under his breath. With that blow, he would have to start over from scratch. Korin exhaled heavily from the stands. Eleonora truly was powerful. Montana, however, saw something else. From his perspective, Eleonora did not have much freedom of movement. Albert had realized the same thing. He already understood the reach of her swords and the width of her steps. He recalled his training sessions with Montana, who had acted as a dual sword opponent. Albert's swings had been blocked again and again, until he finally found a thrust that worked. Even then, Montana's agility had allowed him to evade it. Montana had warned him that he needed to be even faster than his opponent. Albert tightened his grip on his sword. He had learned body reinforcement. He believed he could move faster still. This time, he focused that reinforcement entirely into his legs. He shot forward like a rocket, blade drawn, eyes blazing as he locked onto his opponent alone. He would deliver the fastest thrust and end the match. Eleonora was caught off guard by the sudden burst of speed. Albert was faster than her guard by a fraction of a second, just barely. His thrust grazed the side of her face, slicing her skin. Albert had no time to retreat as Eleonora prepared her second sword. He cursed, seeing the attack coming, but finding his body too slow to evade. Eleonora struck his chin with the pommel of her sword. The blow was brutally heavy. Albert was sent flying, drawing gasps and screams from his friends. Geats watched in despair as Albert crashed to the ground. From a distance, Kudan observed the fight. Eleonora did not follow up with another attack. Albert lay on the arena floor, dizzy and disoriented, his vision spinning. He forced himself to stay conscious with everything he had, but in the end, his strength failed him. He lost consciousness where he lay. The trumpet sounded, and the moderator shouted Eleonora's victory. Yet, Eleonora herself stared at the wound Albert had inflicted. The cut along her face was deep. Blood continued to flow, and her ear had nearly been severed, even with body reinforcement active. She looked down at the unconscious boy in disbelief. A novice had managed to wound her so severely. A small smile appeared on her lips. Whatever thoughts crossed her mind, whatever she saw in Albert, remained unspoken. She turned and left the arena, leaving Albert to the medics who rushed in to tend to him.